A quick like and subscribe really helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more amazing content. Thank you for your support.
It's easy to disregard the little phrases we repeat to each other every day. They slip off the tongue without a thought, yet deep down, they simmer with unsettling implications, like a deceptive calm before a storm. I sat on my phone one night, scrolling through the r/ask Reddit thread titled "What's a Common Thing People Say That Makes No Fucking Sense?" and stumbled upon a comment that rattled me: "You can't have your cake and eat it too." At some point, I'd always assumed this meant you couldn't enjoy something while also preserving it, something about cherishing delicate moments or the transient nature of joy, but as I lay awake that night, contemplating the words, a chill gripped me, and I felt the stagnant weight of their meaning, like a fog manifesting in my chest. I imagined a world where the cake was a real entity, vibrant and pulsating with life, rather than a mere metaphor. What if the cake could talk? What if it were afraid of being eaten? My brain spiraled into dark territory, and suddenly I was haunted by visions of a monstrous cake, with stretch marks of frosting like veins and a maw filled with layered teeth, gnashing and grinding as it lamented its fate. I shook my head, dispelling the thought, but the idea stuck in my mind like a splinter, digging deeper until it festered. Days turned into weeks, and every time I passed a bakery, the scent of fresh pastries would trigger that chilling imagery, making me jumpy and paranoid. Friends asked what was wrong, and I'd force myself to smile, saying nothing could ever take my happiness away, a hollow reassurance that left me feeling more hollow inside. Then one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with blood-red streaks, curiosity got the better of me, and I proposed a dinner party to test my theory out. I invited everything from childhood friends to workplace acquaintances. Hell, I even invited my estranged brother, just to see if the air would crackle with tension. I baked a monstrous cake, a multi-tiered confection towering like a grotesque slice of grandeur, but as I removed it from the oven, a voice wafted through the steam. It was soft, almost pleading, "Please don't eat me." I choked on my own breath, convinced it was my overactive imagination, but as I glanced into the mirror of the oven, I realized the cake flickered with something alive, a dreadful sentience mixed with despair. Shaking off the bad vibe, I soldiered on, convinced everyone would find the unease as charming as I did. A peculiar energy buzzed around the table as my guests arrived, laughter echoing, conversations weaving in and out like a tapestry, but I felt something sweltering beneath the jovial surface, like an impending storm ready to burst. We nibbled on appetizers, shared half-hearted stories, then it was cake time. I declared in a mock-serious tone, "It's not really a party until you have your cake and eat it, too." A nervous laugh escaped my lips, and the cake groaned with humiliation, the frosting trembling like a trapped animal. The moment the knife sliced through, an icy wind whipped through the room, stealing our breath as an unsettling melody began to echo. It was the cake, singing in a sorrowful wail, lyrics pinned like daggers to our hearts as it begged for mercy. My guests froze, their faces morphing from glee to horror, and I faced the horrid reality: the cake knew what we were doing. It didn't want to be eaten, didn't want its essence devoured, but it felt compelled, forcefully drawn into the cycle of sacrifice and indulgence, the age-old predator and prey dance we all conducted as if it were a rite of passage. In that moment, I understood every phrase that had ever left my lips felt like knives aimed at each other. The remnants of our daily whims and social niceties took on a sinister form, revealing the gruesome connection between desire and destruction. I stumbled back, the cake retaliated, bursting forth like a tidal wave, a riverside flood of batter and frosting exploding with reckless abandon. It devoured the table, engulfing my friends like a tidal wave, their screams drowned beneath layers of gooey confection. I stood paralyzed, the last witness to a grand reckoning, every bit of laughter and life swallowed whole, leaving nothing but a heavy silence engulfing that cursed space. And as I backed away, horror-stricken, the whispers of the cake echoed in my mind, "You can't have your cake and eat it too," haunting me like a ghost tethered to its grave, reminding me that we might hold life delicately in our hands, but we're not immune to the consequences of what it means when the things we consume finally fight back, leaving behind nothing but the bitter taste of unfinished desires and a void that fills the spots where laughter used to echo, where friends used to sit, now just the remnants of what happens when you forget not everything is meant to be devoured. It started innocently enough. I had just settled in for the evening after a long day of work when I half-heartedly scrolled through my phone, the glow from the screen illuminating the dim corners of my living room. That's when I saw a post titled "AITA for not recalling my dog when she chased my neighbors off my property," and I couldn't resist clicking it, thinking it might be a harmless read, but instead, my stomach dropped as I read the comments section filled with outrage at a guy who had let his dog protect his home. I was reminded of my own recent experiences. Barely anyone in the small town where I lived could blame Rusty, my golden retriever, for being fiercely protective of our home, given how tight-knit and suspicious the community had become in recent years. 8 months before, I had moved into an older house on the edge of the town, attracted by the charm of the place and the promise of a peaceful life away from the chaos of city living. Little did I know that peaceful nights would become a distant memory. It all began when the neighbors next door started letting their teenage sons throw rowdy parties on weekends, music blasting so loud that it felt as if the bass was reverberating right through the walls of my house. Rusty, who would usually laze about and catch rays of sunlight through the window, began standing guard by the fence, barking furiously at the groups of raucous kids spilling into their yard, and while I initially enjoyed watching him take a stand, I soon realized I was fueling a fire that would not extinguish easily. One Friday night, on my way home from work, I saw the teenagers tagging their fence with spray paint, their laughter slicing through the peaceful air like a butcher's knife. I marched over, my heart racing with a mix of anger and humiliation, but before I could reach them, Rusty bolted from the backyard, tail like a lance, barking like a wolf after its prey, and the kids scattered like roaches when the lights come on. I recall the look on their faces, a mixture of surprise and fear, and for a fleeting moment, I felt a surge of pride, as if my dog was not just a pet, but a shield. However, that very pride resulted in a tension that stretched to the breaking point. The following week, I found a nasty note tucked beneath my door, my neighbors complaining, alleging that I was raising a dangerous beast and that if Rusty kept it up, they'd be forced to take matters into their own hands. I had a good mind to reply, telling them their bratty kids could take a lesson on respect, but instead, I decided it was best to keep quiet. I couldn't afford a war with my neighbors, not after how much they had already escalated the situation. The very next night, however, everything changed. The noise levels reached a crescendo that sent Rusty into a frenzy, his barking echoing off the walls like thunder, and without thinking, I watched him dart out into the night, powerful and unstoppable. Seconds later, I heard a yelp and the unmistakable scuffle of kids as they scrambled for their lives. Rusty had landed headfirst into the chaos. The next thing I knew, I stood rooted in place, half amazed and half terrified as I witnessed my dog sending a group of rowdy teens sprinting from my yard and back to their own like frightened birds fleeing from a hawk. Instantly, I felt a surge of conflicting emotions. What was I supposed to do? Call him back to me and end his glorious triumph? I couldn't bring myself to do it, so I stood there as Rusty continued barking them off my property, my heart pounding with adrenaline. The adrenaline coursed through me like a drug, switching off any rational thought, and I let out a low chuckle when I saw the first wave of teenagers tumble over the fence, half of them slipping in the mud. But then the laughter turned sour. What had I done? The town soon found out what happened that night, the whispers ricocheting between porches like a game of telephone. My phone buzzed with messages, people labeling me as irresponsible, the town's gossip mill eager to twist the narrative until I was painted as a villain, Rusty as a monster. Strangers began asking questions, judging my abilities as a dog owner, and I sank deeper into the quicksand of my guilt. Days rolled into an agonizing week before I got an angry knock on my door. It was the parents of one of the kids Rusty had chased, their faces twisted in rage and accusations flying like daggers. They demanded I control my dog and enforce some consequences. I tried to be rational, explaining that Rusty just wanted to protect his home, but they wouldn't listen. They were right on one point: I hadn't acted like a responsible owner. Yet I still felt it was my dog who should have been celebrated that night. The warriors of my living room, Rusty heroically defending our territory as little more than neighborhood rodents fled. Their harassment continued, and it felt like living under a magnifying glass, where everyone reacted as though I should apologize for my dog following his instincts. I brought Rusty in more often and spent sleepless nights trying to think of ways to diffuse the tension, brainstorming how to befriend the neighbors, but each plan felt futile. I thought about taking him to the beach or the dog park, anything to let him burn off that restless energy. But then the anxiety of encountering those neighbors crept in, and I often just sat there, failing to find resolve. One evening after a long week of silence, I got a strange message from a neighbor I barely spoke to. It was an invitation to a community gathering. Tentatively, I decided to go. Perhaps this was an opportunity to make amends or at least break the ice. But when I arrived, something felt off. The atmosphere buzzed with laughter and chatter, but under it lay a jagged tension that I couldn't shake. The parents of the kids Rusty had chased were there, their backs turned and faces hidden in the crowd. I caught snippets of their conversation. Despite their smiles, they were throwing sharp glances my way, their whispers sharing exaggerated tales of the rogue dog and how I had done nothing. It was a gathering that didn't feel like a celebration but a trial, and I was the accused, my heart racing as if I was about to face a jury. In a moment fueled by desperation and fear, I decided to find Rusty and leave. But when I returned home, I found him missing. Panic exploded within me as I called him, but the house remained silent, the worry gnawing at my insides. I rushed outside only to find the front gate wide open. It looked like someone had intentionally left it ajar. I called out for him until my throat grew raw, but he didn't respond. An hour passed, and I went looking for him in all the familiar spots, but Rusty was nowhere to be found. It wasn't until midnight that I saw headlights cast over my backyard. Rushing outside in a panic, I found myself confronted by a couple of the teenagers who had come to fetch the beast that apparently had become the town's urban legend after that night. My breath caught in my throat when they presented something behind them, a crowd of neighbors tinged with anticipation, fueled by a shared itch for vengeance. The scene felt straight out of a mob movie, and my heart sank as Rusty, panting and confused, stood next to them, his collar now gone. The teenagers had taken him as some form of justice, but in their eyes, it felt more like cruelty. It struck me then that they weren't afraid of Rusty, they were afraid of what I represented, the dog's master, the threat of standing its ground, battling every confrontation until it had no choice but to cave to violence. I blasted air through my lungs, ready to confront them, but somewhere deep in my gut, I felt torn. Could I really blame the dog for acting like a protector, or would I be branded the villain the town had painted me as? I stood there, frozen, and in those moments, I realized the truth. I was on trial, not just for my dog's actions, but for my own choices. And as I stared into the sea of faces, all sunk in shadows, I had to ask myself, the fear they harbored, was it really aimed at me, or at Rusty? The fragile peace had shattered, and whether I liked it or not, I realized I had no real allies left. The uproar continued for weeks, my world transformed into an echo chamber of hatred and judgment. Ultimately, I made the difficult decision to move, packing my belongings in the dead of night with Rusty by my side, a sense of sorrow filling the spaces I left behind. But as we drove away, each mile signified not only distance but an opportunity for a fresh start, one where Rusty could roam freely, where I wouldn't live in fear of judgment. So now, as I reflect on what transpired, I find myself torn between the past and the choices I made, questioning if I was really the asshole for letting Rusty do what he instinctively had to do. Perhaps I wasn't the one who had truly failed, maybe it was the community for turning against an owner who merely loved his dog too much. And as I glance over to my loyal companion, resting his head on my lap, I whisper softly, "Can we try to forget?" But Rusty only looks back at me, his brown eyes full of understanding, as if he knows better than anyone, the past can be a dark place we'd rather not recall. I never thought the word confession would bind me to this web of truth and lies, but here I am, ready to unravel it. I suppose it all began when I was 13, a tumultuous age where imagination and reality seemed to blur into an intricate dance of fear and longing. Growing up, urban legends about our town were woven into the fabric of our existence. The most sinister of them whispered about the old Barclay house, a decrepit ruin that slouched at the town's edge like a weary old man. Countless tales wrapped it in darkness, stories of missing children and whispered curses that snagged on the breezes that sliced down Main Street. It was in this atmosphere of half-formed shadows and unspeakable dread that I first told my lie. I mentioned the Barclay house during show and tell at school, an insignificant mention that spiraled out of control. "My uncle was attacked there," I said, embellishing each word with the envy only a child wishing to be noticed could conjure. A lie to garner attention, to feel, for a moment, the thrilling pity in my classmates' eyes. That evening, as I walked home beneath a swollen autumn sky, something peculiar happened. I began to genuinely fear the house and the stories spun around it. I even started dreaming about that old place, dreams where shadows peeled themselves from the walls to whisper secrets I couldn't quite catch. Oddly enough, the dreams didn't scare me, they intrigued me, as if the house itself were a living, breathing entity reaching out. I became obsessed. Up at night, unable to sleep, I'd find myself gazing out my window where only a sliver of the old Barclay's roof crest was visible, backlit by the town's dim streetlights. My life turned into a revolving door of truth and deception, reality as porous as the town's old ghost stories. I found myself feeding into my own lies, craving the taste of each fabrication's power, a power that seeped into my waking life. Strangely, my parents never contradicted my stories. Their silence seemed complicit, almost as if they, too, feared the legends, which only added layers to my tangled web. As the stories spread, I remember a stranger knocking at our door. Disguised as a harmless letter carrier, She knew everything about me, reminders of my own details now muddled by repeated illusions. Her visit was a trigger, unraveling memories like threads in a tapestry, dragging me into a past where I hugged shadows for comfort. My heart hammered erratically as she asked questions, delicate yet probing. Something about her eyes, that deep murk of old secrets and raw honesty, made me confess my concocted tales, stuttering through excuses that felt like dead leaves rustling on forgotten streets. But then something unexpected happened. A glint in her eyes, a slither of knowing that felt rooted in another plane of understanding, shifted my perception. But what if some of it was true? She whispered, leaving behind a chilling promise, a possibility. Hours later, feeling both lighter and more burdened by what I'd shared, I sat and thought. Who was she? A ghost of conscience or a purveyor of forgotten truths? The questions swirled like autumn leaves caught in an unwilling dance, a dance marked by confusion, guilt, and an odd sense of relief. I became acutely aware that the lines I blurred had become walls in my mind, protecting and hiding emotions buried deep. For days, I couldn't shake off the knowledge that the Barclay house pulled at me, as if accusing me of my fabrications, daring me to reconcile with whatever lurked there. Finally, driven by an inexplicable resolve, I decided to confront the old place. The world seemed to hush as I stood before the ominous framework of the Barclay house, its silhouette etched against the twilight sky like a scar on the town's memory. With every tentative step, reality flickered, its fragile tapestry a mockery of my earlier musings. The door, aged and unreliable as my fabricated memories, creaked open. Inside, the air felt alive, charged with stories untold and ghosts of events long past. Each creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind through cracked windows, seemed to murmur truths all their own. My mind raced with visions, fragments of potential truths born from my own fabrications. As I reached the heart of the house, that old dining room where raindrops played forlorn symphonies on the shattered windows, I realized I was no longer afraid of what had happened to my imaginary uncle. Instead, I felt an overwhelming connection to something I couldn't quite name. As shadows climbed the walls, I heard them, those whispers from my dreams, clearer now, unraveling the knots in my mind. They didn't voice horror or dread, rather a soothing tale, a tale of acceptance, where fiction no longer enticed me to distort my past. The lie I'd spun no longer held me, it released me. As I left the old Barclay house behind, stepping into the chill embrace of night with a heart unburdened, I knew the truth at last, the shadows were mine, and in confronting them, I found not horror but a hesitant peace, knowing that somewhere in the web of truth and lies, I had discovered myself. When I learned of my younger daughter Jenny's engagement, I couldn't have been prouder, a feeling every father dreams of. Her fiancé, Dave, was a charming, humble guy who seemed to adore her. They'd met in college, he was quirky but had a backbone and heart of gold. As the father of the bride, I embraced the ceremonial duty with joy. We booked the most enchanting vineyard for the event, and I promised Jenny we'd cover every expense, an indulgence I never imagined offering any of my children. This was my little girl's fairy tale, and I was determined to make it a reality. However, I never anticipated the chilling unraveling of family bonds that it would stir beneath its glossy surface, twisting happiness into something hauntingly unrecognizable. My eldest daughter, Ella, had always been more restrained, favoring pragmatic choices over fanciful ones. She had married her childhood sweetheart, Mark, in a modest church ceremony 4 years prior. Theirs was a different kind of story, no extravagance, just simple and pure. We offered to contribute, but Ella, valuing independence, insisted she and Mark handle the costs. We respected their decision, never suspecting it would plant seeds of apprehension that would later flourish into ominous tension. The first tremor of discontent arrived when Ella phoned me 2 months before the wedding, her voice strained, hinting at some underlying frustration that lurked beneath polite conversation. She inquired subtly, "Dad, you're covering all of Jenny's wedding, right?" Affirmation on my part was met with a pause, a telling silence loaded with unspoken words. As the wedding preparations continued, subtle oddities began to manifest. Ella, who had always been supportive of her sister, grew more withdrawn. I'd catch her observing the cascading rolls of white silk or the ornate arrangements, her expression betraying a struggle she was trying desperately to mask. One night, sitting in the backyard where we had shared countless stories, I confronted her about it, pleading for honesty. Ella confessed feelings of being slighted, of an inequity that shattered the sisterly camaraderie they once shared. It was as if my decision to finance Jenny's nuptials had rewritten the narrative of Ella's simpler union, painting it in lesser shades. I promised we'd help with a grand anniversary party to even things out, but the wounds seemed deeper than I understood. The evening before the wedding, in the dim light of an autumn twilight, things began to unravel more sinisterly. Strange occurrences, things missing, misplaced, and even small accidents, started haunting the household, sowing nervousness that none of us could ignore. Jenny's veil vanished, then mysteriously reappeared on Ella's dresser, delicate lace shredded as if caught in a thorny snare. Jenny was understandably upset, but Ella firmly denied any involvement, the accusation bringing her to tears. I was torn between my daughters, caught in a tempest where logic was elusive. Ella's denials, though fervent, were overshadowed by an air of underlying tension, the kind you cannot touch, but feel crawling up your spine. On the day of the wedding, a fog crept in, unseasonal and ominous, clinging to the vineyard like a ghost reliving old sorrows. A sense of unease settled over the attendees, a chill that dulled the bright chatter of guests into muted whispers. The moment Jenny appeared, radiant and full of love, a horrifying moment shattered the celebration. As she walked down the aisle, the music stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence. Ella, sitting in the front row, seemed utterly transfixed, her eyes wide in disbelief, focusing on something invisible to us all. In the eerie quiet, the chandelier overhead began to flicker, casting grotesque shadows that warped jubilant expressions into masks of dread. Then, just as quickly, it fell, crashing down in a deafening, heart-stopping instant. Chaos erupted, people screamed and ducked for cover. Miraculously, no one was hurt, but the terror of the moment left its mark. Among the ensuing pandemonium, Ella lied sprawled on the grass, eyes shut tight, as if battling demons no one else could perceive. It was then that she spoke, her voice laced with something far more sinister than sibling rivalry. "It's not just jealousy, Dad. It's the house. It knows." Despite my logical mind screaming to dismiss it, an eerie familiarity washed over me. I recalled how, soon after moving into the house after Ella's birth, the previous owners had warned us of strange energies. We laughed it off as superstitions. Ella's return to the house for the wedding had been enough to reignite whatever had lain dormant, her unspoken fears now manifesting as a force we could no longer ignore. Decades-old latent resentments and fears had found a vessel in Ella's jealousy, harbored so deep that they stirred malevolent whispers within these walls. Haunted by the weight of unwitting neglect and the undeniable presence that had preyed on Ella's dormant insecurities, we fled from the vineyard, abandoning the cursed celebration. We stayed in a hotel that night, shaken to our very cores. The experience forged a fragile peace among us, united in facing something darker and unknown. As Jenny and Dave settled for a quiet courthouse marriage, the looming specter of the house and that day's horror stood as a reminder of a cost that went far beyond the payment for a wedding. Relationships tested and spirits awaken, a family struggled to find healing under the shadow of an ancient malevolence, leaving me to wonder, am I the asshole for paying for one daughter's wedding? Or was it something monstrous lurking, waiting for the moment we let our guard down? I never thought a simple prank could spiral so wildly out of control, until my best friend, Jake, decided to play a game with fate, and now I can't escape the guilt clawing at my conscience. It all started on a balmy Friday night, the moon cloaked behind a veil of clouds, casting an eerie glow over the streets of our small town. We had gathered, as we often did, in the cramped living room of Jake's rundown apartment, the place reeking of stale beer and musty secrets. The guys, pumped on adrenaline and bad decisions, exchanged wicked grins as Jake tossed a crumpled piece of newsprint on the coffee table. "Check this out," he said, his eyes alight with mischief. The article was about an urban legend, a haunted house rumor that had taken our town by storm, whispering tales of a cursed spirit lingering in the shadows, bestowing night terrors on trespassers. Jake, ever the thrill seeker, suggested we do the milk prank of doom, an absurd challenge we'd concocted years back that involved smashing a gallon of milk in a supposedly haunted location and recording our escape before the ghostly consequences trailed us home. Everything inside me screamed to shut it down. I'd heard too many tales of people tempting fate only to end up on the wrong side of a horror story, but Jake wouldn't hear it. "Come on, Greg," he urged, the others egging him on, "it's just a prank." But the sickening feeling in my gut told me this wasn't like the other times. "Jake, I don't think this is a good idea," I warned, but my apprehension only fueled his determination. As they prepared for the impending escapade, I decided to bail, leaving Jake and the rest with a lingering stare that screamed a silent don't. Later that night, the air electrified with a sense of foreboding, and sleep evaded me. I lay in my bed, eyes flickering between shadows, where every creak felt like an omen of disaster, haunted, perhaps, by the stillness of knowing I should have done more. When my phone buzzed frantically at 2 a.m. with messages from a number I didn't recognize, my heart plunged into an icy grip. Each word I read sent chills down my spine, It was Jake, desperately pleading for help, the texts riddled with typos and panic: trapped, can't get out, and she's here. Against my better judgment, guilt drowning out reason, I grabbed my keys and tore through the streets, my car's engine screaming beneath the oppressive night. My headlights cut through the murky fog as I arrived at the decrepit old house, leaning into the night like a specter, its windows gaping voids, the air alive with an unnatural silence that prickled my skin. I found the door slightly ajar, and from within echoed distant cries, a series of stunted breaths and Jake's muffled cries for mercy. As the haunting chill seized me, every instinct screamed to turn back, but the pull of friendship, and fear of what could already be too late, drove me deeper into the bowels of the house. The air grew colder, pressing against me with unseen weight as I moved through the dust-filled corridors of ghostly echoes, the scent of rottenwood and something far more sinister clinging to the air. My flashlight flickered, casting unsettling shadows that danced across the peeling wallpaper, which seemed to whisper a forgotten story, all the while my heartbeat mimicking the rhythm of a death knell. Suddenly, out of the blackness, Jake's voice pierced the veil of shadows, a grotesque half-laughter, half-sob that reverberated around me. "Greg, she's here. She's real," his voice babbled incoherently. I found him in a corner, eyes wide with terror, taut with the maddening grip of an unseen fear. The weight of my earlier warning hung between us like a curse fulfilled, and in that moment, I realized the true horror of our folly. Whatever malevolent force Jake had disturbed, it was far beyond our understanding or control, as if the house itself pulsed with a life of its own. We didn't have time for apologies or regrets. Time seemed to twist and distort as we retraced our steps back to the entrance, the air thickening with every step as the walls began to close in, urging us towards a madness that lingered just out of reach. Just as we burst through the threshold, gasping for the night's chill air, the door slammed behind us with a finality that echoed our severed connection to the world we thought we knew. The scars of that night etched themselves into Jake's and my reality. He was never the same, his laughter replaced with the echo of that haunted sob, and my warnings, once ignored, whispered a haunting reminder of the line we'd crossed. Time passed, but the grip of that night never loosened, and for Jake, the boundaries between reality and nightmare forever blurred. Perhaps I was the asshole for not stopping him, perhaps the true horror lies not in the unknown, but in the things we dare not to believe, lurking just beyond the edge of our own hubris. I always thought the stories about zombies were folklore or, at best, cautionary tales woven by overzealous scientists warning us about the next supervirus. Little did I know that I'd be stumbling into one of these tales when I took a shortcut through the abandoned Rutherford Mall on my way home from the night shift. The place had been shut down for years, a ghostly relic of our city's past glories, now prepping for demolition. I didn't think much about my decision at first. It had been another long shift at the factory, and I was eager to get back to my small apartment and crash. The mall was my shortcut, a dusty and forgotten labyrinth of old stores, but it shaved off a good 20 minutes from my walk. I pushed through a vandalized entrance, its glass door shattered ages ago, the edges glittered ominously in the dim moonlight. As I trudged past what once was a bustling center court, the eerie silence got under my skin, the kind that prickled and whispered at the edges of sanity. I pulled my jacket tighter as I kept my eyes peeled for any signs of trouble, secretly amused by how we'd all been imprinted with danger from an early age about these decrepit places. Wind whipped through the hollow halls, making old flyers dance ghostly around what had been the center fountain, now dry and cracked. That's when I heard it, an otherworldly groan echoing through the vast emptiness, bouncing off faded mall maps and advertisements for obsolete products. For a second, I froze, hoping it was just the wind pushing against some forgotten corner of the building. But then, there was a clatter, like something metallic had been knocked over. My heart rate shot up, but rationality took charge. Probably just a raccoon or some stray animal, I assured myself. Placing one cautious foot in front of the other, I crept towards the origin of the sound, curiosity winning over caution. In the stillness of the shopping mall, I rounded a corner with caution. And there it was, an unsteady shadow looming under the flickering emergency lights left over from the days when people roamed these halls without fear. It was hunched over, ragged breaths infecting the air. My stomach churned as it lifted its head, eyes as vacant as a cloudy sky, devoid of any spark of humanity. This wasn't a person, not anymore, anyway. Rotting skin clung to bones like old meat abandoned for vultures, clothes hanging in dirty, shredded layers. It let out another guttural noise, the kind that shatters whatever courage you foolishly thought you had amassed. The stories I'd heard growing up and in whispers at work surged through me, tales of wandering undead in small, forgotten towns, viral outbreaks that authorities quickly shut down claiming exaggerated paranoia. Was this it? Evidence of some government cover-up, a silent invasion that was happening in the shadow of ignorance? As it staggered one unsteady step towards me, my senses kicked into overdrive. The half-bad zombie clichés from pop culture laughed at my petrified form, luring me with scenarios of heroism, a failed illusion of safety that dies the instant you're faced with something not scripted. I backed away slowly, the instinct of fight or flight firmly fixed on the latter. It didn't follow immediately, stuck in its small radius of reality, but its vacant eyes tracked me, cementing the fear that it was aware, at least enough to register my presence. In that split-second decision, I knew I had to alert someone, anyone, who would believe a tale like this, warn them of what remained only whispers until now. Running back through the mall, I half expected more of them to appear out of vending machines or crawl spaces. The rusty escalator, dead from years of neglect, seemed more like monstrous teeth ready to devour moonlit shadows. My breath wheezed and my chest felt like it might explode by the time I burst out onto the street again, gulping down air as though it might be my last. The world outside was oblivious, just as it had been when I entered, and it chilled me to the bone. I contemplated calling the police, but how do you frame this without sounding like a raving lunatic? "Hello, officer, I just saw a zombie in an abandoned mall." "No, really, I'm serious." As the adrenaline coursed through my veins, I hesitated, head in hands under a flickering street lamp, knowing that this was the sort of situation that past me would have brushed off or mocked in a chat room. The rational part of my brain argued it must have been a homeless person, perhaps afflicted by some horrible illness, a victim of circumstances so devastating they slipped through every available safety net. Yet, deep down, between the fear and disbelief, something else nagged at me. I had seen enough to know that what I apprehended was not something simple. The image of those cloudy eyes bared a scar on my memory that no logical explanation could erase. As I finally gathered my wits enough to head home, avoiding dark alleys and secluded routes, I wondered if this was a singular encounter or the beginning of something darker. As I slipped inside my apartment and deadbolted the door, the thought wouldn't leave me. Maybe tomorrow, or a week from now, this would all end up being a misunderstood myth, or maybe, just maybe, it was a warning, waiting to unravel into our unsuspecting lives. I never imagined how quickly one choice could lead to such chaos. It started with a simple request from my pregnant sister Chloe, who was in the last trimester of a grueling 9-month period filled with morning sickness, back pains, and mood swings that seemed to oscillate like a pendulum. When she asked me, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and desperation, if I would switch rooms with her, she painted it as a matter of comfort. The new nursery was right across the hall, and she insisted my room was far cooler and quieter. But I just couldn't bring myself to say yes. After all, I had spent years making my room my sanctuary, a collection of my favorite posters, band memorabilia, and the only space in the world that felt truly mine. I hesitated, guilt creeping in, but the truth was I needed that space for the gaming setup I had worked tirelessly to earn through part-time jobs. My evenings spent alone in my dim-lit lair were my escape from everything else in life that felt like a ticking clock, and when I finally replied, my voice shaky, I told her I couldn't do it. Her reaction was immediate, and I'd never seen my sister cry in such a disheartening way. She was a tornado of emotions, loving yet furious, and it became clear that my refusal felt like a betrayal. The drama unraveled quickly after that. My parents became involved, twisting the entire situation into a grand debate where I was suddenly the selfish villain of our house. I could hear their murmurs through the thin walls, the muffled tones of frustration and disappointment, and Chloe's desperate sobs clawed at my sense of worth. Every time I tried to defend my position, it only seemed to ignite their anger more. They framed it as a moral obligation, an act of love towards my sister expecting her first child, while I sat there feeling like a stranger. The very walls of the house were turning against me. Days went by in a cold war, where Chloe refused to speak to me besides throwing glares sharp enough to cut glass, and the atmosphere became unbearable. I began to feel suffocated not only by the weight of my own decision but also by the tension in the air. I avoided my meals just to escape into my room. But even then, I could feel the vibrations of unresolved conflict reverberating through the floor. It was one evening, during one of those power outages that seemed to occur when storms rolled in, that the darkness stole away my sanctuary. There was nothing left but the flickering of candles, shadowy figures of furniture looming with prying eyes, and I'm not ashamed to say I heard soft whispers, like echoes floating through the air. I convinced myself it was just the wind, but the chilling sensation crawled over my skin. Whatever entity resided in that darkness thrived on my shame and self-doubt, whispering words that sliced through my resolve, and despite the terror curling in my stomach, I finally stood up, determined to sort things out with Chloe. As I stepped into the hallway, the Darkness enveloped me like a shroud, each step echoing off the walls until I reached her door. I knocked softly, but the only response was the rhythmic thumping of my heart, a void where our relationship used to breathe life. I knocked again, my heart breaking with every hesitant tap, yet silence swallowed my efforts. I took a deep breath and opened the door, plunging into a puddle of shadows and uncertainty, the dim moonlight slicing through like a surgeon's blade, revealing Chloe sitting on her bed clutching a stuffed bunny, tears fresh on her cheeks. I opened my mouth to apologize, to beg for forgiveness, but as I stepped closer, the air thickened with inexplicable dread. The shadows around her rippled, morphing into dark, twisted faces, their mouths moving in a syncopated chant that I couldn't quite comprehend. Words danced around me in an alien tongue. Chloe raised her head suddenly, her face painted with a grotesque smile that sent chills spiraling down my spine. It was her face that I recognized, yet her eyes were now deep wells of void, blackened pools swirling with a darkness that promised to consume everything I was. "You should have switched rooms, brother," she rasped, her voice layer upon layer of echo, as if 100 people spoke through her, and the whispers in the corners of the room grew louder, circling me, leaving a bitter taste in my mouth. "It's too late now." I bolted, adrenaline slashing through my veins, and as I turned to escape, the shadows lunged at me, tendrils wrapping around my limbs, yanking me down as Chloe's voice rang hollow in my ears. The walls warped and twisted, the laughter of all those distorted shadows mixing with my screams, merging into a chilling cacophony that drove me deeper into madness. I felt claws of regret ripping at my sanity, dragging me down into a pit of despair where my every moment of selfishness morphed into an unbearable weight. I fought and clawed, but the shadows devoured every shred of light, whispering sweetly lies of my failure as they secured their grip on my legs. Finally, I broke through the doorway, stumbling back into my own room, desperately slamming the door, heart racing as I leaned against it, panting, trying to rationalize the madness that had just unfolded. But the darkness wasn't finished. Every corner in my sanctuary pulsed and breathed like a living thing, shadows creeping and curling at the edges of my vision. I tried to convince myself it was all a nightmare, that Chloe was just being overly sensitive, but every flicker of movement felt like a taunt, a punishment, and even as I desperately reached for the gaming console that once brought me joy, it fizzled into nothingness, the familiar sound silenced, leaving behind an oppressive void I couldn't escape. That night marked a turning point. I lay awake as shadows loomed above me, and with each passing hour, I felt my sanity fraying. Days turned into weeks, and Chloe's situation came to culminate without resolution. The shadows growing closer, the whispers becoming unbearable, as I remained frozen in the corner of my room, haunted by the choice I had made. My family claimed I had turned into a recluse, but they couldn't understand the horrors lurking just beyond where the light stopped, whispering for me to choose again. It was easy to say I didn't care anymore, to wear ignorance like a shield, but every hesitant interaction with Chloe was an agonizing reminder that I had failed her, the consequences of my refusal haunting us both, turning my sanctum into a prison. And just like that, the night of her delivery approached, the house charged with anticipation, but all I felt was dread. Deep down, I knew things would never be the same, and when screams of agony echoed through the walls, I knew the shadows had come to claim their due. The question popped up in my feed late one night: what is one thing you would never buy, even if you had $1 billion? I chuckled at first, thinking of the ridiculousness of it all, but then I stared at the screen, the glow illuminating my anxious expression, and realized that if I were to ever answer, it would be an old, rotting house at the end of Hollow Maple Drive. I knew it would take more than $1 billion for me to even think about it, nor would it matter if that amount magically appeared in my bank account, because there are places on this earth that have a price but can never truly be owned. I was 13 when my friends dared me to explore it during the summer just before we all headed to high school. They were giggling, tossing around nonchalant wagers as we made the trek, but my lungs felt tight with each step, almost as if the air were heavy with something I couldn't quite name. The creaking boards beneath our feet seemed to grow louder the closer we got, and when we finally stood before the shaking, peeling doorway, I was struck by a sense of dread that kicked off something primal inside me. They dared me to enter, as friends will do. I had to prove I wasn't scared, so taunting each other as all kids do, I pushed my way inside and was swallowed by darkness. It was even darker than I pictured, the silhouettes of shadows flickering on the walls from the stray beams of flashlight as my friends yanked out their phones, sending little circles of light into the gloom. I felt like we had crossed an invisible threshold. I was going to die here, or worse, only because the house was a dreadful relic no one wanted to speak about, and I had this insane feeling that it knew that we were there, that it was waiting for us with an ancient hunger. The air felt electric, thick, until one of my friends, Jake, tripped on a protruding floorboard, crashing against the rickety table in the kitchen, and what happened next is where my memory blurs into something contradictory and surreal. A rough, raspy voice echoed through the gaping corridors, a whisper that seemed to seep from the very corners of the house, wrapping around us like a fake fog. It said, "I know what you want." What we wanted. To escape, for starters, but then there was that curious notion pulling us, a suffocating need to delve deeper, even as fear seeped into our bones. Jake laughed nervously, trying to lighten the atmosphere, but the sound felt wrong, hollow, warped by something that would never let us escape. We stumbled upon a room filled with moth-eaten furniture and faded photographs, their subjects distorted, their features melting into grotesque forms in the dim glow from our flashlights. I could feel it, the sensation of something watching from a distance, the silence pulsing like a heartbeat. That's when Lucy, always the skeptic, backed away slowly from the darkness, her face pale, eyes wide as she murmured something about getting a bad vibe, but the house only seemed to tighten its grip on her, pulling her in like it yearned for her very essence. Before I could respond, the door behind us slammed shut with a resounding finality that fractured our collective sanity, stopping our hearts cold. The air turned frigid, and the lights flickered with a malevolent glee. Our phones died one by one like fireflies crushed beneath the weight of fear. Without a way to signal for help, we felt we'd been lost in a twisted nightmare. The whispers began again, echoing off the walls like wails from beyond, and it was then I truly learned the house was alive, that it fed off the terror trapped within its stillness. Time did not exist as we searched for an exit, Jake screaming at the top of his lungs, hoping to drown out the strange and terrible sounds that surrounded us. The house was alive and wanted something from us, something I could feel deep down in my bones, a hunger only known by ravenous things. It yearned not just for our flesh but for our memories, to peel back our layers as if the house were a doctor unearthing long-stuffed traumas. One by one, we began to lose sight of each other. The air thickened until I felt as if I was drowning, yet there was no water, only an abyss of despair. I finally pushed my way into a room with walls covered in splintered mirrors. I expected to see my reflection, but what stared back at me were shadows of my friends, twisted in agony and despair, their mouths forming silent screams and eyes wide with terror. I felt a cold grip around my throat, not from fear, but from understanding. The house fed on our worst moments. Suddenly, the lights pulsed rapidly, casting disorienting shadows across the walls, morphing our realities with each breath, as if the house was teasing us, playing with our memories like a cat toying with a mouse. My heart raced, and panic erupted. I slammed my fists against the mirrors, trying to break the spell, to shove reality back into place, but it only made everything worse. I could hear the echoes of Lucy's sobbing, Jake's choking gasps, yet none were in reach. I could feel the space closing in on me, my body constricting as the house wrapped around me, claiming me piece by piece, and for the first time, I realized that I might never escape. I surrendered entirely, whispering apologies to nobody in particular, pleading to the shadows that had taken my friends. Then, as suddenly as it began, the pressure lifted, a wave of tranquility coursed through the room, and it flooded me like an unearthly warmth. And just in time, I stumbled back, breath escaping my lungs, and fell back against the door, pulling it open to the light of the heavens outside. I ran until the house vanished behind me, feeling an ancient weight release as I stumbled on the dry gravel of the road, but I never once turned back. I got home long after the sun dipped behind the horizon, heart thundering in my chest as I swore never to mention that house again, not even to my friends, although I could feel something still lurking in the corners of my mind, waiting for me to slip. Years later, after moving to a different state, I heard a news story about that same house being demolished, and something deep inside me twisted with fear that no one ever really escapes anything, not entirely, anyway. Sometimes, I take a moment, staring at the sunset, and wonder if that ancient darkness has found a new soul to feed upon, wondering if someday it will reach for me again. But I always answer with the same truth: some things can never be bought, not even with $1 billion. For the longest time, I had a fascination with what people deemed dumb decisions, like how I watched the same bad movie over and over or how I found solace in collecting seemingly useless trinkets. It wasn't until one rainy night, while scrolling through the abyss of Ask Reddit, that I stumbled upon a thread asking, what's something considered to be dumb but actually is a sign of intelligence? The answers were as diverse as the individuals who posted them, ranging from people humorously sharing their gaming strategies to those reflecting on the complexities of human quirks. Yet one comment caught my eye. It spoke about a phenomenon that had lain dormant in me but was now bubbling to the surface. The user claimed that talking to oneself was often dismissed as a sign of madness, but in reality, it indicated a person was processing their thoughts, organizing their ideas in a world too chaotic to handle. It ignited a flicker of recognition within me. As the rain drummed against my window like an impatient child, I felt the urge to test this theory. I closed my laptop and wandered into my cluttered living room, the remnants of the day surrounding me like ghosts from my past, an old trophy from high school, dusty books stacked without purpose, and a few wilted plants teetering on the edge of existence. I began to speak to myself softly, trying to unravel the threads of my own tangled mind. I'd ask questions like, why did I not pursue that job opportunity? Or what does happiness truly mean? As I articulated my thoughts aloud, I felt a strange liberation, and ideas flowed in ways they hadn't before. I realized words were powerful, and their sound echoed back at me, creating an accidental dialogue of sorts. I became captivated, wanting to push this further, and as I went deeper into this exploration, the hour grew late, and I found myself in a trance-like state. Then a chill crept in, cutting through my focused haze, and it struck me that I was not alone. The air was thick with a creeping sense of unease. Every so often, an odd creaking noise from the house echoed, like whispers in a haunted room. But I brushed it aside, insisting it was just the house settling, and continued to converse. I found myself narrating the story of my life, a serialized essentially self-exile, languishing in my mundane day-to-day existence, when suddenly, I paused as my eyes caught the flicker of something just out of my line of sight from the hallway. It was a shadow, too tangible to be a trick of the light, and for a moment, my heart raced, and I felt a primal instinct wash over me. It was fight or flight, yet curiosity got the better of me. I abandoned my internal dialogue and ventured toward the hallway, drawn like a moth to that flicker. "Hello?" I called out. Silence enveloped me, yet I felt the air change, thicker, almost electric. Then, in an inexplicable flash, I recalled a childhood memory watching a documentary on the paranormal with my sister. They said that, when spirits are near, they sometimes mimic the sound of the living. It felt preposterous, yet as I stood there, heart thumping, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was, indeed, paying attention to me. "Are you there?" I asked again, my voice steadier this time. Just as those words escaped my lips, a soft whisper echoed in return. The voice was unmistakably mine, yet layered with something sinister, almost like a distorted echo. "You've finally listened." Panic rose in my chest, and with it, a dark curiosity. I was breathing heavily, yet I felt grounded in a way I hadn't anticipated. "Who are you?" My voice trembled. "I am you," it replied, yet the tone was different, slick as oil, and laced with something venomous. "I am the version of you who never let go." In that moment, the realization struck me hard. This was no mere manifestation, it was the representation of my regrets and all the dumb decisions, the forgotten aspirations. In voicing them out loud, I had unwittingly summoned this dark twin, a creature that thrived on the neglected thoughts that I thought were harmless quirks, yet it had festered into something grotesque. My mind was racing, and for the first time, I truly understood what I had been doing to myself. I had isolated my intelligence into moments of absurdity and neglected the real fears, the fear of failure, of taking risks, and of confronting the truth. The shadow twisted, coiling itself around the memories I had unwittingly given life to. "Do you think it's clever to talk to yourself when you can't face the world?" it mocked. "You believe you're processing, but look where you are now, a prisoner of your own making." I felt every accusation lash against me, detonating the frail confidence I had worked to build. I stepped back, wanting to escape, and suddenly it erupted into laughter, a sound that resonated deeper than I thought possible, echoing my insecurities. I turned and ran, desperate to retreat to the sanctuary of noise, but no matter how fast I moved, I could still hear it lingering behind me. It whispered everything I had buried, twisting my own words into weapons. I stumbled into my room, slamming the door shut, but the laughter pierced through, crawling under the skin of my sanity, each giggle a reminder of the choices I had avoided confronting. I grabbed a lamp and held it out like a shield, trembling in the dark as I prepared to fight something that was, in reality, a part of me. "You're not real," I shouted, but the sound was hollow, even to my ears. "I am more real than you'll ever be," it countered, its voice striking like a sledgehammer against my resolve. "I've watched you hide, I've watched you fail, and I'll always pull you back into the shadows." Then suddenly, everything fell silent, no more laughter, no more whispers, just an enveloping darkness. Breathing heavily, I dropped the lamp. "What do you want?" My voice broke through the quiet. "I want you to wake up. I want you to stand up for yourself," it murmured, more like a beckoning than a threat. "It's time to stop pretending. Talk to me out loud. Fight me. Dispel the myth that you're dumb for feeling, for doubting, For stumbling. Only by accepting me can you be whole. I felt the darkness pressing in, forcing me to confront how I had hidden from myself. Suddenly I understood, talking to oneself wasn't a sign of madness, it was the first step toward clarity, a line bridging the conscious and subconscious, demanding a complete reckoning. "You're a part of me," I whispered back, my voice fragile yet resolute. "And you won't define who I am." The shadow flickered and for the first time, I saw it shimmer, not quite solid but emanating a kind of energy, just enough to say it had been waiting for me to acknowledge its existence. I took a deep breath and began to speak again. Not to it, but to myself, fiercely listing everything I longed to do without fear, without hesitation. I felt the room shift, felt it begin to lighten ever so slightly as I gave voice to the version of me that wanted more, the one that realized the path to intelligence was riddled with flaws, and that was okay. I could almost see the shadow recoil, its laughter hollowing out, being replaced with something softer, almost tender. Whatever darkness had loomed over me began to twist and reshape into something utterly foreign. My voice grew stronger, and as I spoke of resilience and dreams, a light erupted inside, bathing the room in a glow that shattered the silence and dispelled the lingering fog. My dark twin dissolved into wisps and drifted away, leaving me with an overwhelming sense of clarity. In that moment of vulnerability, armed with my truths, I discovered the bittersweet paradox: although dumb decisions mask layers of insecurity, they could also unveil the profound intelligence of self-reflection. Finally, I felt free, liberated from the weight of expectations and empowered for the first time, no longer a prisoner of my own making, but rather a cautious adventurer stepping into the light. I first noticed the ads, those customized, eerily precise ads, always appearing just moments after I'd thought of something but hadn't yet voiced it. Curious about tools for my garden? No sooner would the thought flit through my mind than I'd find offers for unheard-of gadgets scrolling across my screen. For the longest time, I wrote it off as coincidence or the sheer magic of digital marketing sorcery. But things took a dark turn last year when I stumbled onto a subreddit dedicated to delving into the mysteries of the digital world. One post caught my eye, titled "The Algorithm That Predicts Death," dismissed by most as an internet hoax, a trickery of data miners preying on the gullible. But something about it chilled me, and, skeptical as I was, I couldn't shake it off. The notion that an algorithm somewhere was collecting data, beyond just our daily movements, habits, or preferences, processing even our unconscious thoughts, estimating our very lifespan, lingered in my mind like an unwelcome guest. Intrigued, I joined a group of online enthusiasts convinced there was more to it than mere speculation. Among them was James, a data analyst, or so he claimed. Over encrypted chats, he explained that in the deep recesses of the web, whispers buzzed about a program called Chronos. Developed by a rogue faction of coders, it was designed initially to monitor health metrics, predicting illnesses based on physiological and behavioral data inputs. But, somewhere down the line, its function had warped and ventured into territories not meant for algorithms, or humans, for that matter, delving into prediction models so advanced they bordered on the prophetic. James swore he'd seen its predictions come true, exactly to the date, for several undisclosed test subjects, shared with him by a guilt-ridden scientific community defector, anonymously, of course. He described cases where changes in purchase history, subtle shifts in music tastes, and even patterns in sleep tracking data had been used to forecast mortality with ghastly accuracy. Still, I remained skeptical until he dared me to test it out. He directed me to a shadowy segment of the web, a place you'd only find if you were supposed to, he cryptically declared. My heart raced as I typed commands that shouldn't exist, letting its tentacles dig into my digital life. A crude interface popped up, eerily devoid of branding or color, just a stark command line with a date so outlandish I couldn't help but laugh. Little did I understand the gravity of playing deity with codes and statistics. Taking this matter meticulously, I decided to challenge the program, altered my lifestyle, diet, exercise, social interactions, tinkering with whatever it utilized to sculpt its dreadful forecasts. Yet, the date never wavered. It haunted my nights, lurking in the background music of my dreams, whispering its unwelcome hymns. Affected, I noticed my reflection growing pallid in tandem with the looming date, a specter threatening to suck the life birthed from pixels and paranoia. Days slipped like sand through an hourglass until only a week remained undisturbed before the ominous prediction. The smoking gun arrived via a televised emergency announcement. A string of unlikely deaths had matched a list recently leaked online by an unknown source from a classified sector of the web. It took a mere heartbeat for my blood to run cold. First were the faces, coincidentally, individuals chronicled in our clandestine group, followed by deathly quietude from a community that once thrived in fervor. The dread within our digital sanctum was palpable. At that juncture, James infrequently communicated, disjointed notions of escape and abandoning everything digital engulfed his elongated messages exhibited in haphazard timestamps. Yet, on the eve of my precipice, his last transmission arrived. Verify with someone credible existed outside the net. They will never affirm its truth because they fear their survival. More a riddle than solace, I embarked on this final quest for possible salvation. Emerging from the electronic entanglement, I confronted, and conquered, my reality through trials in temporal domains constructed by choice, not by lines imbued with arithmetic echoes. Experts dismissed my inquiries with chuckles laden with incredulity. Nonetheless, within every amplified laugh hid an alienated glimpse of acknowledgement, accompanied by the unsaid horrors of having sighted the beast within the binary jungles we erected out of ignorance. Throughout these confrontations, however, one peculiar incident, humored as a kooky subset scenario, that a defunct doctor inadvertently mentioned but quashed moments post-utterance, aroused disconcerting embers suggesting corroborated linkages to overlooked incidents aligned perfectly with the inadequately explained disappearances. In that thin membrane between accepted rationale and lingering enigma, I comprehended a grim existence persists, forever behind static symbols lost beyond incalculable compositions, perhaps, in a realm thriving where our understanding blurs till forsaken cognition defers to instinctual judgments. I choose otherwise, defying nature and providence, allowing a thought exist until extracted unsupervised illuminated triumph simply sailing within proximities unknown, somewhere unified beyond mortality itself, beyond the omnipresent divide sheltered by encumbered nature. Now, days become nights funneled within every tolerance beyond broken ciphers once crafted for us autodidacts keen on challenging realms we forge alone yet unparted. It all started on a day like any other, under the lusterless glow of the morning sky, as I trudged to my job at the nondescript office building that resembled a massive concrete slab more than an architectural achievement. My routine was numbing, a ritual of tedium that ate away at my soul like acid, but that day would be unforgettable. I had decided to try out a device my cousin had mailed me, an inconspicuous little vape pen that came with a note, for stress relief, seriously, you need it. Now, I've been around the block with weed, but this was something different, something my cousin, known for his adventurous esoteric taste, had sworn was the next level. The first sign things were off was the immediate uptake, no warm-up to the experience, no slow crescendo, just an abrupt plunge into an altered state of hyper-reality where time trickled like syrup through the mind's sieve. It was nearing noon when I entered the office, and I had barely parked myself at my desk when the walls around me began to breathe. The drab grays and off-whites pulsed with a life they shouldn't possess, and I swear I could hear the distant hum of a giant engine thrumming beneath the building. Was it my heart? The flickering overhead lights took on a sinister rhythm, the fluorescent tubes buzzing out a Morse code I couldn't decipher but felt was ominously specific just for me. At first, these sensations were amusing, akin to the visual oddities one experiences at a funhouse, but they quickly escalated into something far more insidious. The computer in front of me loomed larger than life, each pixel on the screen expanding and contracting as though breathing too. I opened an innocuous spreadsheet, hoping the monotonous task might anchor my fragmented mind, but the columns became an ever-shifting maze of numbers, a digital labyrinth that seemed to extend into infinity. The numbers writhed like serpents, coiling and uncoiling, whispering secrets in a language I was terrified to understand. Panic gnawed at my insides, but it was another feeling, a prickling skitter of fear and loathing, that truly unsettled me, as though I were being watched, scrutinized by unseen eyes that revolved endlessly in an unseen realm just beyond the edge of my vision. I staggered up, needing to breathe air free from the manufactured staleness the air conditioning exhaled, and stumbled into the office's tightly enclosed break room. It was there that I met James, my kind but perpetually aloof colleague, who seemed suddenly transformed into a caricature of all things horrific. His eyes bulged, mirroring the desk lamp's harsh glow, like a figure from some twisted noir comic, and his grin sliced across his face wider than ever before, a Cheshire's nightmare. "Hey!" he boomed in a voice that sounded too layered, as though two James were speaking in discordant harmony. "You look like you've seen a ghost?" I laughed, or barked, rather, as I attempted to assure him everything was fine, but my voice betrayed me, warping as distorted echoes in a cavern of madness. I knew I had to leave, every fiber of my being screamed that much. I couldn't risk anyone else noticing the paranoia, the creeping dread now curling around me like a suffocating smoke. I mumbled something about an upset stomach, the lie-tasting chemical and foul leaven as I spat it out, and lurched toward the elevator. As the metallic cage descended, Slow and ponderous against my racing mind, a thought occurred to me with the violence of an alien intruder: what if the elevator never stopped? What if it plunged into an abyssal trap, an endless loop of descent? I imagined the mechanics failing, cables snapping, flinging me down, endlessly down through an unknowable void. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to harness reason amidst the maelstrom, but there it was again, that drumming engine, relentless, echoing persistently behind my eardrums. The doors opened, finally releasing me into the marbled foyer that glistened slick and artificial under cold LED lights. But they weren't normal lights, rather, they emitted a dirty luminosity that twisted the expensive lobby into something unsettlingly kaleidoscopic. I half ran, half flew out, not even sure if my legs were making contact with the ground. Outside, the sky was an endless void of sepulchral clouds, denying me the solace of sun or shade. I felt a primal urge to ground myself, so I staggered to a nearby bench, an island of solidity in my swaying world. The bench seemed to swallow me whole, and I collapsed there, trying to anchor again through breath, deep, intentional, fighting against the current of panic that surged within. My mind was a whirlpool, thoughts and fears spiraling in a cyclone of consciousness that seemed irreparable, but beneath it all was a mounting claustrophobia, a fear of being trapped inside myself, forever. It could have been minutes, hours, or even days that passed as I sat there, though the logical part of me knew it was probably just 15 minutes, a cosmic joke considering how it stretched into infinity within my subjective timeline. Passers-by moved around me like apparitions, fleeting shadows who acknowledged me not with their eyes but with flickers of disregard. As reality finally began to reassert itself, or perhaps it was the come down from the GFP, the great freaking pen, I realized my heart had steadied, the worst of the hallucinations had begun to retreat, and the world resumed its mundane hues once more. I still don't know exactly what my cousin had sent me that day, whether it was meant as a perverse experiment or a clumsy mistake in potency, but it altered my perception forever, leaving in its wake an indelible scar on my psyche, a reminder that sometimes the horror isn't an external force lurking in the shadows, but rather, it is the monstrous depths within us when our minds unravel. And so, I resolved never again to partake in any unknown mind-altering experiments, for now I knew that 15 minutes was more than enough time to live an eternity in a personal hell, conjured by none other than myself. I never thought I'd have to post here, seeking strangers' judgment on whether I've forsaken my family. Growing up, my sister, Lily, and I always perceived ourselves as a team. We navigated the tumultuous waters of a dysfunctional family, leaning on each other during our darkest moments. Our parents were the kind who gazed upon their children with a sense of perpetual disappointment, their aspirations forever unmet. They staggered through life, attempting to cultivate the pristine image of a family built on love and support, yet the deceptions only contorted our reality. After years of feeling like an unwanted shadow under Lily's brighter light, I was finally able to escape the oppressive gloom after I landed a job across the country. I discovered my niche in the tech industry, my isolated brilliance finally recognized, leading to a salary that even surprised me. Life was good, or so it seemed. Meanwhile, Lily played the role of the prodigal daughter. Artistic and charismatic, but financially adrift, her constant quest for self-discovery unfolded in a series of failures that punctuated her 20s. Eventually, she returned, calling our family home her sanctuary after a big breakup. Her dreams once again evaporated into thin air. While I was building a life miles away, I stayed in touch as much as I could, weekly calls with Mom, Christmas visits, obligatory birthday texts to Lily. But one day, everything changed with a phone call thicker with desperation than the usual familial chat. It was Mom, insisting I was financially obligated to step up and assist them. They didn't sugarcoat it this time, they needed help paying their mortgage. The walls of our family dynamics crumbled further when they declared they had decided Lily would be moving back home to help manage finances and care for them in their old age. They thought me, the successful son, would swoop in as their economic savior. But beneath those innocent pleas for help, resentment teemed, the expectation that I indebted myself to those who had once scorned my potential. They believed Lily's presence entitled me to pay their way, as though my financial efforts should be redirected because she was all the comfort they needed. My initial refusal was met with shocked silence, soon eclipsed by a bombardment of guilt and emotional manipulation that left me simmering with anger and guilt. Conversations became blurred with commodity. I was no longer a son or a brother, but a credit card. Moreover, there was something off about Lily's involvement. A sense of foreboding clung to her return like a shadow, a peculiarity in her voice when I reached out. Her texts were scarce, her messages growing eerily short, like the echo of a ghostly presence in a family home. One evening, burdened by insomnia and anxiety, I decided to confront the whispers haunting my mind. I called the house, a vintage rotary tone resonating, but no one answered. Yet, out of nowhere, Lily's voice filled the line like a static-filled apparition. The way she spoke was somehow wrong. Her normally vibrant cadence morphed into a monotone drone, offering chilling tidbits about our parents' strange new expectations and her unsettling ability to blend into a silence nobody could penetrate. It was then her words echoed something sinister. "It's okay now. They don't ask questions anymore. When you don't pay, nobody dreams." Her giggle was added by a noise most unsettling, a click like the sensation of a noose tightening. Alarmed and driven by an ominous urgency, I hopped on the next flight home determined to discern the truth behind the unsettling illusion of normalcy they wanted to project. Our house stood untouched, cloaked in shadows, its soar no longer a familiar warmth but a chilling stillness. Inside, things were passed from hand to dust, the once vibrant semblance now adorned in an ominous film. Mom and Dad sat in their battered armchairs, silence unwrapping around them like an unused script. They didn't react much to my arrival, their faces devoid of the welcoming confusion I expected. I found Lily upstairs, far more amiable in the soft lighting, yet a glassy look marred her once sparkling eyes. Her expression struggled between strained patience and flickers of inspiration turned to fear, as if she were attempting to convey a message her lips hesitated to form. While the days dissolved into cluttered conversation, Lily's muted whispers filled my nights with dread. Every sound in the house seemed exaggerated, my presence growing more like a rudderless wanderer among them. The final day brought the truth slinking out of the shadows when I confronted her, propelled by the silence that pushed me towards madness. In the broken remnants of our childhood's sanctuary, she stared blankly, her breath a fog of sentimentality clashing with confusion. Then she confessed, our parents weren't exactly imposing, but rather insidious, puppeteering from shadows just beyond perception. They manipulated reality, summoning an alternate dependency on the house itself, a haunting evoked from our dependence. The house fed on our guilt and our fear, an entity bound to our familial ties, stealing dreams if unfed with disturbing silence. It demanded constant attention, some form of sacrifice, their mortal offerings paid through harrowing expectation. Only, when the funds didn't come through, nor the required emotional output, reality bared its jagged teeth, clamping around our supposed lives. As the truth unfurled its sinister grip over us, the response didn't unshackle Lily, she remained cocooned in a web of dreams spun into compliance. But I couldn't relent, couldn't let the house become another tether in my life full of restraint and regrets. With the sheer resolve to sever the chains, I made my decision as dawn broke its delicate majesty over the horizon. I will not be shackled to visions haunting my siblings' eyes nor tethered to a household enshrouded with expectations bearing its fangs beneath false warmth. I walked away, confronting their disappointed stares, their wrath, a battered storm. I left them cocooned in the silence they so feared if not satisfied. Am I the asshole for refusing the cost of familial entrapment? Tell me. Please, someone, tell me. For the past few months, I've been living in a financial paradise that slowly unfurled itself into a waking nightmare. It started subtly, with my bank statement displaying a number that seemed off. As it turned out, my company had initiated a new payroll system, and thanks to a glitch, I was receiving triple my regular salary. At first, it felt like a dream, an unexpected windfall that arrived unannounced at precisely the right time. Life's pressures softened, debts that once loomed like dark clouds evaporated, and desires once delayed danced into reality. New car, luxurious getaways, and weekends spent in opulent excess became my new normal. I told myself, surely they'd catch the mistake soon, and I stashed away enough to cover any eventual return. But as the months rolled on and the anomaly continued unchecked, my conscience swayed between exhilaration and dread. It began to feel less like a glitch and more like an unseen force had thrown a lifeline into my dull existence. Nights out on the town brightened as drinks flowed like reckless confidence, each purchase felt like an act of defiant freedom against life's otherwise monotonous grind. Yet, the tranquility was a mere facade that crumbled with every ticking second of indulgence. Anxiety crept in, quietly at first, as whispers of mistrust among colleagues reached my ears. Were they aware? Did they notice the sudden improvements in my attire, the stories of spontaneous trips? I could almost feel their eyes trailing me in the corridors, each glance a silent accusation unspoken. I started double-checking emails, rereading every correspondence for hidden clues that my secret was out. The fear entwined with greed, forming an insidious bond I couldn't sever. My sleep was haunted by dreams where I was marched into my boss's office, eyes cast down as knights of finance delivered their verdict. But when daylight broke, the nightmare felt distant, And my rational mind concocted justifications. Maybe they knew and decided it wasn't worth correcting. Maybe this was an unspoken reward for years of underappreciated toil. My paranoia spiraled until one night, when insomnia and guilt were my only companions, I noticed something peculiar. A peculiar email lurked in my inbox, marked with a subject that struck icy terror through my veins: urgent, payroll reconciliation required. It was after midnight, and I hesitated to open it, breathing uneven as though my entire existence hinged on those unread words. My eyes raced through the lines, detailing a full audit of expenditures over the past several months. They were onto it. Horrified, my mind danced through scenarios on how to handle the inevitable confrontation. I considered running, crafting an escape plan that felt almost exhilarating in its madness. Perhaps a transfer to a remote island where questions didn't exist, a fantasy as palpable as it was absurd. But sanity prevailed, and I knew I couldn't keep evading reality. The next day, no amount of caffeine could chase away the wrenching tension gnawing at my insides as I reluctantly trudged to the office. My steps echoed with fateful finality down the pallid corridor leading to HR's domain. The meeting was orchestrated with professional detachment. Their expressionless faces delivered what my heart already knew. A ripple of panic undulated through me. I heard someone, perhaps it was me, making a hurried confession, words fumbling over themselves with promises of repayment, explanations spun from desperation and half-truths. The room was still, the air charged with disappointment and protocol. My pen scratched against paper as my fortune was redrawn in legal terms and repayment plans. The facade of fortune crumbled, its illusion breaking to reveal the stark monotony of numbered debts and accountability. But deep within the chaos, I realized something remarkable. It wasn't just my bank account that had transformed. I had changed, too. The experience left an indelible mark, challenging my morality and reshaping my understanding of luck and consequence. As I walked back to my desk, remnants of a life momentarily bolder, the weight of each step felt lighter, relieved of the secret I had carried for too long. In the end, the anomaly was corrected, and so too was my misplaced sense of invulnerability. I never considered myself superstitious, but the day I found the note tucked beneath my bedroom door, I felt a chill run through me that I couldn't shake. It read, "If you're reading this, it's already too late," written in a trembling hand that inexplicably made my heart race. At first, I thought it was a prank. Perhaps my friends were trying to freak me out as they often did during our late-night gaming sessions. I had brushed the note off, tossing it into the trash with a nervous laugh. But that night, one by one, the lights in my apartment flickered before dying altogether, shrouding me in an unsettling darkness. I tried to shake off the dread gnawing at my gut and curled up on my couch, telling myself it was just a faulty circuit. As I sat there, the silence was suffocating, too quiet, until I heard a scratching sound coming from beneath my couch. My pulse quickened as I crouched down to get a better look, expecting to find a rogue mouse or at least a lost dust bunny, but instead, I saw nothing. The scratching persisted, now accompanied by a low, almost rhythmic thumping, like an internal cadence, a heartbeat, slow and deliberate. I froze, feeling a strange compulsion to listen, when suddenly the thumping stopped, leaving behind a silence that was even more unnerving. I stood up slowly and decided to check my phone. Maybe a late message from a friend could lighten the mood. But when I looked at the screen, that familiar fear crept back in. There were no notifications, nothing saved, just a single missed call from an unknown number. The call had gone through at precisely 3:33 a.m., a time I knew too well, as I had often heard it referenced in urban legends about curses and spirits. I paced through my apartment, my mind racing, but as I brushed past the hallway mirror, I suddenly felt an overwhelming urge to look into it. I almost gasped when I caught a glimpse of something shadowy just behind me in the reflection, yet when I turned around fully, there was nothing there. Panic surged through me. I realized I'd been breathing too quickly as I held my phone tightly, feeling the latent fear boil up as strong shadows crawled along the walls. I couldn't ignore the note. Maybe it was more than just a silly prank, something darker was certainly unfurling around me. I thought about the people who used to live in this apartment. How long had it been since they left? There were whispers in the building about odd occurrences, but I always shrugged them off, chalking them up to stranger-than-life coincidences. They couldn't have meant anything serious. I shook my head. I really needed to get a grip and breathe. As if the universe wanted to contradict my attempt at bravado, a loud crash echoed from my kitchen, and it felt like my entire body went numb. Steeling myself, I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously made my way toward the sound. The kitchen felt cold and alive, like everyone had vanished but I was still being watched. And there it was, a half-open drawer. My knife set scattered across the floor, glinting unnaturally in the beam of my flashlight. With gut-wrenching tension, I knelt down, wondering if whatever was haunting me had left a message after all, maybe something tangible, something to explain. And in that moment, the lights flickered back on, dancing wildly in their sockets, and it allowed me to see as I hadn't before. The kitchen was devoid of life, but there, a single clean knife was suspended in midair, as if held by unseen hands. I stumbled back, gasping, as if the air had been sucked from my lungs, horror flooding my senses. I sprinted back to my living area, dialing the police with shaky hands, but before I could even hit the call button, I flinched at a low whisper erupting from every corner of the room surrounding me. "You shouldn't have ignored the note." My heart was pounding like drums in a funeral procession, and it was then that I noticed something strange, a pool of darkness enveloping the space around me, crawling and stretching like living shadows. Forgetting my phone, I dashed toward the front door, praying it wouldn't be locked, because I had become acutely aware of the fact that I was not alone. I tugged down on the knob, but it wouldn't budge, as if it were actively resisting my desperate attempts to escape. I slammed my body against it, fear coursing through me with every heartbeat, and for a moment I felt like I might actually break free. Just as I gathered enough momentum to make one final push, the whisper echoed again, this time with a sharpness that felt like fingernails scraping across my skin. "If you want to leave, you have to unlock the door." Suddenly, my mind raced through the chaos of the last hour. What was the key? I thought about the note. I had ignored it, but what if it carried the truth? Frantically, I scanned the room, searching for anything that resembled a key, a sign, a way out of this nightmare trapping me inside. Just then, I remembered the call from the unknown number. Could it be connected? With trembling hands, I checked my voicemail, because in that moment, that tiny sliver of hope was my only escape. But there was nothing, just static, punctuated with what sounded like my own name. "Please, please, no," I murmured, my fingers shaking above my screen as I dismissed the voicemail. The whisper swelled around me, now sounding like panicked laughter, mixing in with the unholy thumping that reverberated in the back of my skull, the voice no longer my own. In desperation, I grabbed the knife from the floor. I had never considered myself brave, but perhaps I could use it to free myself from the grip of that malevolent force. As I turned to face whatever force loomed behind me, the shadows coalesced into a single figure, my own form reflected back, yet distorted and grinning wide, eyes wide with madness. It taunted me, a mocking version of all my deepest fears and insecurities. "You can't escape me, you should have listened," it hissed. I raised the knife, ready to strike, when I noticed the flicker of the light grew dimmer, and the figure melted into the darkness surrounding me. Struck by clarity, I whispered the note back to myself, "If you're reading this." And realization crashed into me like a tidal wave. The note itself became the key. I needed to reverse the mantra. The words were meant to trap me, but inside my fear, I felt a spark of defiance, fueled by the desire to break this cycle of terror. I shouted into the darkness, "If you think I'm too late, maybe I'll make my own time." Without hesitation, I plunged the knife deep into the wall behind me and watched as the shadows recoiled, revealing the outline of a door that hadn't been there before. With newfound strength, I shoved it open, gasping at the blinding light spilling in, free and fresh like oxygen after drowning. I stepped through, my heart racing but alive and pulsing once more. Catching my breath, I turned back one last time. I could see shadows writhing amongst echoes of desperate whispers of fear, but I pushed onward, leaving behind the twisted reminder that if you're reading this, you need to remember to pay attention, because sometimes, delaying action means playing a game with something far darker lurking in the edges of human experience, an encounter forever marked by the chilling realization that ignorance can breed horror, if you let it. There's a certain peace that comes with realizing you've completely given up on yourself. No expectations, no pressure, just an unsettling nothingness. For the last 3 months, I've been living in the shell of myself, a ghost haunting its own flesh. I have no job, no friends left to pretend for, and my apartment looks like a crime scene. Once vibrant with laughter and life, it's now a shrine to my inertia, cluttered with trash and the unwelcome scent of decay. But it's not the clutter, not the joblessness, that got to me eventually. It's the empty reflection in the mirror, the dull eyes staring back, eyes that had seen too much but were too afraid to see any more. That's when I started noticing the whispers, faint and indistinct at first, like wind slipping through the cracks. They seemed to murmur from the walls, a symphony of hushed voices that crescendoed into choruses I couldn't ignore. I always had a fascination for the supernatural in my better days, you know, a fleeting interest in the ghost shows on TV, bored afternoons spent reading about paranormal theories when I should have been working. Little did I know it was preparation for the terror that would unravel my sanity. One gloomy evening, with rain battering the windows like distant drumming, I first heard them clearly, or, rather, felt more than heard, a soft susurration in my ear, as intimate as a lover's whisper. "Why haven't you fought yet?" they asked. Panic made my blood run cold, a fiery iciness that rooted me to the spot. Trembling, I turned to find an empty room wrapped in shadows, the silent answer to my fear. I tried reasoning, dismissing it as a product of my isolation-breeding hallucination. Yet, night after night, the whispers persisted, with new voices adding to their eerie choir, weaving tales of regret and lost courage. I set up cameras in desperate curiosity, convinced I could prove to myself it was all in my head. What I saw instead was far more unnerving. The footage showed my apartment in grainy monochrome, static-filled and ordinary except for a faint movement. From the corner of the screen, a flicker, like the air bending, slowly turned towards the camera. As it moved, shapes formed, vague but distinct enough to outline faces twisted in silent wails, an agony caught in perpetuity. They shifted as the night progressed, flowing like ocean currents, murmuring in their ceaseless pursuit of peace. I felt I'd been imprinted on by the spectral chain, sinking with their burdens and followed by questions I could not shrug off. Was I supposed to help them? Or worse, join their ranks, another muted soul consumed by regrets? Their presence seeped into my dreams, veering them into nightmarish landscapes filled with shadowy echoes of myself, stripped of life's purpose or solace, always begging, "Take action. Fight back." I couldn't figure whether it was guilt or a genuine plea for saving myself, or them. My days bled into each other, reality smeared with doubt and dread. Yet, slowly, as if painstakingly crafted, an answer revealed itself. In a burst of feverish inspiration, or maybe desperation, I grabbed a can of spray paint and began scrawling on my dingy walls. Words flowed, ideas I'd ignored for years, concepts that seemed foolish before suddenly demanded life, a manifesto to confront the unnerving void within me. Each line translated into the fiery whispers of the haunt, a validation, a record of who I once was and maybe could be again, if I dared. As I worked, the weight of the voices lightened, their babble transforming into something akin to cheering. A quiet optimism seeped from my mind, unsettling yet wholly mine. In small defiant victories, I pried open the blinds to let slivers of sunlight invade the darkness, threw away rubbish, and cleared the space of its gloom and odor, not as acts of reclaiming my life but as reminders I still had commands. But inevitably, with each piece of baggage discarded, I expected a confrontation from my spectral companions, a reckoning or release. Instead, they diminished, leaving only a whisper of gratitude trailing the edges of my perception, as if tethered to a destiny tied directly to mine. That's when I knew, their liberation was bound to my own resolution, intricately meshed into the loud silence I had so foolishly embraced. Now, when I look in the mirror, I recognize the eyes that meet mine. They're still tired, yes, but there's a glint, a fight tethered to the stories and messages I honored on my walls. I don't claim it was easy or that I'm completely free of my haunted existence, but there's a marked difference. I'm living, not simply existing. The whispers still linger if I let my guard down, remnants of shadows born from tangled psyches. They remind me where complacency leads, where giving up buries you. But I'm no longer afraid of the work it takes to wrestle myself from despair's grip, to push beyond the whispers that urged my inaction. Though I have no grand ambitions or a perfect life mapped out ahead, whatever shape my world takes is sculpted by my hands, not drawn by phantoms. I might be a little broken, but that's all right. I've gathered my shards. From them, I'll build something new. After all, the hardest confessions are the ones whispered to yourself in the dur pit of the night, but it's also where the first seeds of change grow, echoing quietly, "Fight." After my father's funeral, the weight of loss settled deep in my chest, constricting my thoughts like a vice. For weeks, sorrow had photocopied itself around the house, but what bothered me most was my father's office, an area I had never dared to enter, filled with dusty relics of a man who seemed larger than life, which now felt like an impenetrable fortress of memories. Curiosity nodded me when I finally decided to wander in, fingers trembling around the brass doorknob, the hinge groaning as if warning me against what lay on the other side. The room smelled of aged paper and a faint hint of cedar. It was as if time itself had taken refuge in this space, and I braced myself as the light from the window cast eerie shadows across the furniture, illuminating the chaos within, stacks of yellowing documents, books piled haphazardly, and an ancient-looking typewriter in the far corner. I could feel my heart racing, the air thick with unspoken truths that seemed to vibrate off the walls, and when I approached the desk, a heavy, immaculate piece of mahogany, I noticed a leather-bound journal tucked away beneath a pile of invoices, the cover cracked and embossed with my father's initials. Adrenaline shot through me. Such an intimate piece of his life hadn't been shared with anyone, and against my better judgment, I opened it, the pages frail and brittle like the words they held. I should have closed it, turned away, lived with the mystery, but the ink seemed alive, thrumming under my fingertips, and as I read, it swept me into a web of madness. In scrawled handwriting, my father described the death of my mother, something I'd never properly understood. It was always just "she's gone" tinged with sorrow, but now each entry detailed a spiral of despair, his pleading to the universe, desperate attempts to contact her beyond the grave. What struck me most were the last few entries, where ink splotches bled like tears and wild phrases bounced off the pages. "She's coming back, and I found a way," and cryptic drawings of circles filled with symbols I didn't recognize, and I felt a chill settle over my skin, goosebumps prickling at my neck. The compulsion to dig deeper overwhelmed my fear. I needed to understand what had driven my father to this edge. Was his grief leading him to madness? I tried to talk to him about it days before, but there had always been a wall between us since Mom died. I flipped through the pages frantically until my eyes landed on something that made my breath hitch, a description of a ritual to summon the dead. My pulse quickened as the implications sunk in. What if my father's descent into this desperate search for connection had gone further than I imagined? The more I read, the more pieces fell together in jagged rows, like a puzzle that suddenly made sense. I could picture him, midnight candles flickering around the office, chanting those strange words from the journal, longing for my mother to return from whatever abyss had taken her. My hands shook as I turned another page and gasped at the final entry. My father confessed he had indeed performed the ritual, brimming with confidence that his efforts would bring her back, detailing a basement location in our old family home where he'd held an awakening last week, the day before I'd found him cold and unresponsive in his study, a photograph of my mother clutched tightly in a vice-like grip. The realization crashed over me like icy water. He had called for her, and part of me felt a dreadful anticipation mixed with the ugly anguish that had already stained our home. I hastily left his office, the journal tucked safely under my arm, dread clawing at my insides, wondering what I had unleashed by simply being so close to it. I had to investigate the basement where he'd performed this hideous act. The staircase descended into darkness more oppressive than any memory I could muster. Fear was a tangible entity wrapping around my throat, but I pushed myself down each creaking step, my heartbeat echoing in the stale air. The basement was an unfinished shell of a room. The walls were bare and the smell of dampness clung heavily, but in the center of the floor was a makeshift altar, complete with scattered, empty candle stubs and the remnants of twisted herbs I recognized from the journal. I knelt closer, noticing scratches on the old floorboards surrounding the altar that looked disturbingly like claw marks, as if something had either struggled against or clawed out from the ground itself. Acting against every instinct telling me to flee, I opened the journal once more, and the last page had the invocation scrawled hastily in my father's increasingly frantic handwriting. Without thinking, I began to recite the words aloud, my voice trembling yet almost drawn into a trance by the gravitas of the moment, the shadows around me seeming to thicken as the room pulsed with a strange energy. Suddenly, a low creaking filled the air, and my heart raced with both fear and excitement. This had to be my imagination or the remnants of grief, until the atmosphere shifted and something cold brushed against the back of my neck, causing me to halt mid-chant. I turned, half expecting the spectral form of my mother, but the darkness only stared back, folding upon itself like a curtain, and then, through an impossible cracking sound, the air felt electrified. I fell in love with the girl from the True Crime podcast, and now I'm starting to think she might be more than just a voice in my headphones. It all started on a rainy Wednesday night, the kind where the sound of droplets against the window serves as the perfect backdrop to the sinister tales that she weaves into my ears. Her name was Emily Graves, and she had this hauntingly melodic voice that wrapped around me like a comforting shroud while she meticulously dissected unconventional murders, the psychology of killers, and the darkness that lurks in the shadows of everyday life. I was captivated not just by the stories but by Emily herself, her passion, her determination to uncover the truth. Each episode seemed like she was reaching out to me, pulling me deeper into her world. I listened to every episode religiously, often replaying them late at night as if she were speaking directly to me, and in those quiet moments, I felt a bond growing between us, as if I were her only audience. One day, while scrolling through Reddit, I discovered something that sent chills down my spine. Emily had been investigating a series of disappearances in my town. I remember reading the names of the victims, a shiver creeping along my spine as I realized that her latest episode centered around a case just blocks from where I lived. The more I dug, the darker the rabbit hole became, Local authorities had deemed it an unsolved mystery, but to me, it felt personal, like she was somehow pleading with her listeners to help her find the truth. The episodes hit differently now, a sense of dread intermingling with my fascination. She was flirting with danger, and I found myself obsessively reaching out on social media, sending her messages of encouragement and support, voicing my shock and intrigue and always hoping that my words might somehow reach her. One evening, she posted inviting listeners to a local meetup for podcasters and fans in a cozy little cafe downtown. Of course, I had to go, my heart racing at the thought of finally meeting her, despite the pervading sense of watching shadows and the gnawing fear I might not be what she imagined. When the night arrived, I felt a magnetic pull as I stepped into the cafe. There she was, wearing a crimson dress that accentuated her wild curls, her laughter mingling with the muted tones of conversation. As I approached her, my heart pounded like a war drum, but she smiled when I introduced myself, and for a fleeting second, the world around us faded away. We talked for what felt like eternity, my nerves diffusing as her dark humor and intelligent conversation drew me in deeper. But we were interrupted by a hushed commotion at the back of the cafe. A man had stumbled in, breathing heavily, and as he looked around, his eyes met mine with a wild intensity. I don't know what compelled me, but I reached for Emily's hand and squeezed it tightly. She looked over in confusion. Moments later, the strange man lurched toward the door. Fear etched across his face, and I watched as he darted back into the night, a chill coursing through me, erasing the warmth of our connection. Afterward, Emily seemed off, her laughter fading, her gaze distant as she brushed off the disturbance as nothing more than a drunken patron. But I could see the unease lurking beneath her skin, and my protective instincts kicked in. When the meetup concluded, I offered to walk her home, desperate to ensure she was safe. We strolled under the streetlights, exchanging stories, each word pulling me further into her haunting world, but our laughs began to fade as we approached her apartment. That's when she dropped the bombshell. She had received anonymous messages, some claiming to know the true story behind the disappearances, others threatening her to stop her investigations. Panic washed over me. How could I let this happen to the woman I had come to care for so deeply? Unable to contain my fear, I insisted we report it to the police, but she was reluctant, fearful they wouldn't take her seriously and would dismiss it as a prank. But standing there, my heart racing, I knew I couldn't walk away. I stayed at her apartment that night, restless and protective, determined to keep watch. The morning passed uneventfully, but as dusk melted into darkness, Emily received a new message, her phone vibrating against the table between us, shrouding the air with foreboding. My skin prickled with a primal instinct, and as she read the chilling words, I felt as though the walls were closing in. It didn't take long before I noticed someone lurking outside her window, a shadow draped in darkness, taking advantage of the night, and it made my blood run cold. My heart raced. I approached the window cautiously, pulling back the curtain just enough to catch a glimpse of the figure. It was the man from the cafe, rugged and wild-eyed, his gaze fixed hungrily on Emily's door. My instinct screamed at me to act, to protect her, and before I could think, I stumbled backward, grabbing Emily's shoulders firmly as I warned her in whispers that she wasn't safe. We decided to leave, to call for help from my place instead of waiting for the unknown threat outside to make a move. We exited through the back alley, keeping low, not speaking as we tiptoed away from her apartment, my eyes darting, scanning the shadows. I expected to see the world through a thriller lens, a play-by-play of a story I'd heard so many times, but the cold grip of reality became apparent the moment a scuffle sounded behind us. He had followed us. We ran blindly, adrenaline surging, my grip steady on Emily's hand as we navigated alleys and side streets in the dark, gasping for breath, panic wrapping tightly around our throats. I could hear him behind us, his footsteps echoing, relentlessly pursuing. Just when it seemed like despair would take over, we stumbled upon a stark strip of neon lights illuminating a bar. We dashed inside, hearts racing, adrenaline coursing through our veins like fire. We found ourselves crouched behind the bar, whispering hurried explanations, my pulse hammering in my ears and her terrified eyes searching mine for reassurance. I told her no one would find us here, that we'd be safe, but the din of the bar masked the unease that settled in my gut like a coiled snake. As we huddled together, the atmosphere thickened with tension, smoke curling around us like the very secrets she had always dared to uncover through her podcast. Hours passed, the bar slowly emptying as the late-night crowd dwindled, yet I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched. It was then the bartender approached, a menacing smile creeping across his face, leaning in closer as if to offer a comforting word when he nodded to the door. "I've seen him watching from across the street. You two should go before he comes inside." My blood ran cold, instinct screamed at me to run. We rushed to the exit, but as we burst outside, the street felt hollow, only the distant echoes of our hurried breaths reminding us we were alive. I scanned the street frantically, but he was gone. The air felt heavy with dread, and for a moment, the world stood still. Emily grabbed my arm, her eyes pleading, and as I turned to assure her, I felt it, the glimmer of movement behind a nearby truck. The man, eyes glowing like an animal in the night, escaped the shadows and lunged toward us. It happened so fast, I pushed Emily aside, taking a wild swing, my heart pounding, my fight-or-flight instincts kicking in, but my fist connected with nothing, and I staggered backward, breathless as I turned to see Emily had vanished again into the darkness, and panic filled the space where she stood. "Emily," I yelled into the night, fear clutching my chest as I dashed around, the world closing in and shadows taunting me. I could hear nothing but the echo of my voice, the thrill of fear consuming me. This was a truth far darker than any podcast premise. Emily was gone, and as I scoured the streets, a cruel reality pierced my soul. I had fallen in love with a girl from a story, and now I was the one left desperately trying to write the ending before it was forever buried under the weight of unsolved mysteries and echoes of sinister laughter that mingled with the rain. I've been married for 10 years, and through all our shared memories and laughter, there's one secret lurking behind the curtains of our love, a truth so monstrous that I can't bear to tell my husband, Derek, nor can I banish it from my mind. When we exchanged vows, everything felt perfect, but I found myself keeping a piece of myself hidden, buried beneath layers of reassurance and borrowed smiles. It began one rainy afternoon when I got lost exploring some old antique shop, the kind that smells of mildew and history, and there, on a dusty shelf, lay an ornate, silver locket. Inside was an inscription that read, "To love is to fear." Something about that phrase struck deep, and as I slipped it into my pocket, a chill spiraled up my spine. When I got home that evening, I found Derek waiting on the porch, cozy and inviting, and I convinced myself there was no harm in tucking the locket away, a secret just for me, until the day everything changed. It started with the nightmares. They were ordinary at first, strange shadows creeping in the corners of my mind, but soon escalated into terrifying encounters with figures whose features were blurred, their voices a cacophony of hushed threats. I'd wake up gasping, the oppressive weight of something I couldn't name pressing against my chest, and each morning, I'd stumble into the living room, feigning normalcy because how could I burden Derek with these phantoms that seemed hell-bent on consuming me? I brushed it all aside until one fateful night when he took my hand, staring into my eyes with an intensity that felt both comforting and unsettling. "What's going on with you?" he asked, the kind of question that made my heart race with the weight of what I was hiding. I wanted to scream about the entity, the feeling of being watched, the sensation that someone, or something, was living inside the mirror, reflecting all my darkest fears and whispering promises of a reckoning, but I didn't. I smiled instead, assuring him it was just work stress and that I loved him, hoping he would let it go. The weeks passed, but then the horror seeped into reality. One evening, I discovered my locket lying on the kitchen table as if it had been waiting for me, its presence almost mocking in the harsh light. I pocketed it without thinking, the nocturnal terror had beaten me into submission. But that night, Derek woke up, his breath uneven, and whispered words that made my blood run cold. "It came to me too," he said, his eyes wide, flailing in some desperate panic. "I saw it in the mirror. It wants us." The moment he uttered those words, every hair on my body stood on end. I should have told him everything, the voices I heard, the way I felt those shadows brush against my skin, but I couldn't, paralyzed by fear that doing so would seal our fates. I needed to keep my husband safe, needed to protect him from what lingered in the boundary between dreams and waking life. But the nightmares grew stronger, the whispers louder, until, one evening, I caught Derek speaking to the mirror, his reflection wearing a twisted grin that didn't belong to him. "We should listen," he said, his voice smooth and enticing, a nod echo that didn't sound quite right. My heart sank as I called out to him, my knees shaking. "Derek, please don't." He turned slowly, eyes glazed, as if a curtain of shadows had draped over his mind, and in that moment, I knew the darkness was claiming him too. Desperation took hold of me. I disregarded the danger and reached for the locket, my fingers trembling as I opened it, its inscription now a cruel reminder of my fear. I could no longer keep silent, I had to compel him back. "We need to fight this, Derek," I shouted, hoping to pierce through the veil of whatever had ensnared him. But he only chuckled, the sound chilling me to the bone. "Fight? It's too late for that." I didn't know how, but I could feel him slipping away, and then he turned back to the mirror, Entranced as haunting whispers filled the room, each one twisting deeper into my soul. My scream echoed through our home, a visceral plea to bring him back. Meanwhile, the ancient words dripped from the darkness, hollow and haunting, suggesting we join them in a world where fear and pain ruled, where the act of loving meant surrendering our essence to something greater. My knees buckled as I felt the mirror's allure pulling me in, and I wanted to run but felt anchored, a puppeteer caught in the strings of despair. I clutched the locket tighter, desperately recalling all the times my heart had fluttered with joy, the memories that had sewn us together, and only then did the reality of my choices collide with my body like a freight train. In that chaotic moment, I understood the gravity of my secret, the harrowing truth that I couldn't escape the darkness that I had conjured, the part of me I had feared all along. As Derek stepped closer to the glass, a hunger in his gaze, I knew I had to take a stand. This couldn't be the end, not like this. With every ounce of strength, I hurled the locket against the mirror, watching it explode into shards, each piece embodying my sorrows, my regrets, and my desperate hope for light. The moment the locket shattered, a flood of energy surged through the room. Derek faltered, his connection to the entity severed as he blinked back to reality, confusion replacing arrogance. I seized the moment, rushing into his arms as the reflection behind him writhed and contorted, screeching with fury. "We'll figure this out together," I cried amidst the cacophony of shattering glass, clinging to the remnants of our love, knowing the battles ahead would be treacherous, fraught with the ever-looming presence of whispers from the shadows, but that we were in this fight together. What I couldn't tell him, what I wished I could speak without fear, was that our love had always had the power to conquer even the deepest horrors, and together, no matter how dark our nightmares became, we would always fight for each other, bound by a love stronger than the abyss threatening to consume us. I never thought a simple birthday gift could lead to an unraveling of reality, but here we are. It was my girlfriend Sarah's birthday, and despite being together for 3 years, I still struggled with gift-giving. I had heard her mention, perhaps in passing, that she adored handmade crafts with a personal touch, so I decided to make her a quilt. I had no experience with sewing, but how hard could it be? After weeks of late-night YouTube tutorials, I finally stitched together something that resembled a blanket more than a quilt. It was imperfect yet heartfelt, comprised of fabrics cut from clothes that held memories, ours together. On her birthday, her face fell as she unwrapped it. But as soon as her fingers traced the fabric, her expression twisted into something between disgust and fear. "Do you not like it?" I asked, bewildered. "It's not that," she whispered shakily, "it's... he made me one just like this." My stomach dropped. She had never mentioned an ex-boyfriend skilled in quilting 101. He was Anthony, a man she had shown me an old photo of, tall, brown hair, a ghost of someone who left her long ago. We laughed it off, dismissing it as coincidence, until that night. As I drifted into a restless sleep beside her, I heard the undeniable shuffle of fabric from the corner of the room. I switched on the bedside lamp, only to find nothing. Just the quilt, now sagging strangely over the chair. Sarah was already awake, eyes darting between me and the quilt. "It's just fabric," I reassured, though uneasy. Suddenly, the room grew cold, as if an unseen wind whispered terrible secrets into our ears. As Sarah dozed uneasily, I stayed awake, listening to the silence punctuated by my racing heart. Sleep claimed me eventually, but I awoke to a whisper, a name. Her name, uttered in a voice that wasn't mine. Shadows darkened the fabric's intricate stitches, swirling into a pattern reminiscent of a man's face, Anthony's face. Panicked, I gathered the quilt, intending to dispose of it immediately. But Sarah stopped me. "Once you make it," she explained in a voice alien with fear, "he comes." Her gaze was distant as if navigating an internal battleground of memories. "He said if I ever received another." She trailed off, shivering. Desperation clawed at my mind as I pleaded for clarity. She finally conceded that Anthony, in a twisted passion, had crafted and cursed the last quilt before he took his life, binding his spirit to it. If someone unknowingly replicated the gift, his spirit would return. "We could burn it," she suggested quietly, a last resort in defiance of the legend, but fear lingered that we'd only fan the flames of his wrath. Days passed, brimming with paranoia, as every creak of our old apartment signaled his approach. I caught glimpses, from corners, in mirrors, the quiet afternoons warping into nightmarish visions of him staring back with cold black eyes, unblinking, angry. Our haven felt violated, a mausoleum of dread. One evening, Sarah's tearful eyes met mine as she whispered moments of shared happiness with him, moments now poisoned with his spectral afterlife. We decided to burn the quilt, despite her trepidation. As we threw it into the flames, the fabric screeched, Not of thread but of a voice, his voice, ripping through the air. The fire twisted unnaturally, embers dancing in the shape of a man's outline before fizzling into ash. We hoped it was over. Days turned into weeks, our lives resuming normalcy but never quite shaking the chill. Yet the sense of foreboding buoyed beneath the surface like an untold horror lurking in daylight's shadow. Then came the dreams, not nightmares, but vivid, intimate moments with Sarah, different, loving and sinister. They weren't mine, I realized one unsettling morning. They were his. Inescapably, he had tangled himself with us until reality and his phantom memory became indistinguishable. Was I the asshole for trying to purge our lives of him, when all I did was stitch closer to doom's fabric? Each morning, Sarah's eyes grew vacant, mirroring nights haunted by intangible intimacy. Realization dawned cruelly, the quilt was not the gift, it was me. A stitch in time repurposed his claim. Trespassing his territory of memories invoked a pact sealed in love, vengeance, and time. Now entwined in this labyrinth of longing and jealousy, my act of innocent thoughtfulness awakened a tapestry of terror. As I look over at Sarah, I see not a companion but a buffer between what is ours and what's claimed by him. And when I'm alone, sound asleep, his eyes find me still, always watching, eternally waiting for the silhouette of that cursed quilt to wrap around us once more. I always believed that I knew every quirk and habit of my husband, Tom, who I had shared the last 7 years of my life with. We built a life together, filled it with laughter, intimacy, and comfort, or so I thought. Lately, though, something was strikingly different about him, and it gnawed at me like a relentless itch I couldn't scratch. It was subtle at first, a fleeting shadow in his eyes that seemed to whisper secrets I couldn't comprehend. I dismissed it initially, everyone has bad days, stress from work or family obligations, and Tom was no exception. But the instances of something being amiss increased, tiny aberrations that seemed inconsequential alone but began weaving an unsettling tapestry when viewed together. Conversations would start with his usual warmth but seamlessly spiral into moments of total vacancy, like he was suddenly absent despite his physical presence. He often repeated stories he'd experienced as if telling them for the first time, swearing he'd never shared them with me before. At dinner, he would crack his usual dad jokes, but upon seeing my laugh, a puzzled look would cross his face as if he didn't understand why I found them funny. In bed, he moved differently, his familiar embrace replaced by a type of mechanical coldness that sent chills down my spine. I brushed these observations aside, attributing them to stress until the night he slept-walked for the first time. It was around 3 a.m. when I shot up in bed, my adrenaline spiking, to see Tom standing eerily still in the corner of our bedroom, facing the wall. My heart hammered as I called out to him, softly at first, then louder. No response. He just stood there, breathing shallowly, whispering something I couldn't quite catch. I got up and gently guided him back to bed, figuring it must be some strange, isolated incident. Except it wasn't. The following nights, it happened again and again, his nocturnal mutterings growing in clarity yet still evading full comprehension. Words like remember, she, and the doorway would slip through his lips, but the threads wove no coherent meaning. He seemed to be existing in some alternate reality during his sleep, one I was desperately intrigued and terrified to understand. I awoke one morning to find him awake already, which was unusual. He was staring out the window, a deep furrow set between his brows, and I caught a glimpse of immense sadness in his eyes, the kind of sadness one sees in someone who's lost everything. When I touched his shoulder, he jolted as if unused to my touch, and responded with a feeble attempt at a smile. Just tired, I guess, he brushed off, placid and unconvincing. Each day felt like the prelude to an impending storm, and I felt helpless as though bracing for a destruction I couldn't see. The climax came one rainy night when I awoke again to his absence in bed. The house was deathly silent, all but for the murmuring that hummed from somewhere. Carpeted feet led me cautiously down our creaking hallway to the basement door that stood slightly ajar, a faint glow spilling out from beneath it. I swallowed the growing lump in my throat and called out to him, voice breaking against the stillness. "Tom?" No reply followed but the continuing, now recognizable, but still cryptic voice, echoing up the stairs. My curiosity pushed back the fear as I descended. The basement was shrouded in shadows, save for the illumination of an old lamp casting a circle of light on the concrete floor where Tom sat hunched over. With papers strewn around him covered in frantic scribbles that meant nothing to me, he looked foreign in my eyes. He flipped through them, muttering with increasing urgency. When he finally glanced up at me, what struck through my heart was not his evident distress, but the unyielding glaze of recognition, or lack thereof, staring back. It was as if he didn't truly see me, or worse, didn't know me. "I'm remembering," he finally uttered, the refrain hauntingly secured in his tone, something both he and I couldn't quite comprehend. "Remembering what, Tom?" I quivered, the dread was poisoning my every word. "Everything," he replied, this single word draped in a gravity that punctured the air, but still leaving me in darkness. Before I could ask more, he started reciting a date that was in the near future, and my own name punctuating it like a beacon. "Tom, please," I shouted, desperate to rouse him from wherever his mind was trapped. Abruptly, he stopped, his face softening into a mask of confusion as if waking from a deep trance. "Darling. What's happening?" he asked, voice drenched with fear and bewilderment. I managed to pull him up the stairs, back into the light, both of us trembling as the fear danced vigorously between us. The remnants of whatever scenario played in his mind lingered like a penetrating fog, the details buried just beneath the surface of recognition. From that night onwards, Tom gradually returned to his version of normalcy, but the underlying unease remained. I could see it in the flicker of his eyes when he thought I wasn't looking. He would occasionally still whisper in his sleep, the words slipping out like ghosts, "Remember. She." The doorway and, heart-achingly, my name tethered to an unspoken future. Whatever it is Tom is remembering, whatever doorway he's nearing, I fear it holds something that neither he nor I are prepared to face. It's as if he's caught between two worlds, and I fear the day may come when he crosses a threshold where I cannot follow. As Tom drifts further into this murky sea of half-truths, I keep watching, loving him, but knowing, despite the refusal of my heart to accept it, that something is off about my husband, and perhaps it can never be undone. Sometimes, the simplest actions reverberate in the darkest ways, leaving us entangled in consequences we never foresaw. It all started when I moved into a nondescript apartment building in a quiet neighborhood. Everything seemed typical on the surface: late-night cat yowls, the occasional shout of a couple arguing from across the hall, and the faint, comforting aroma of someone's dinner wafting through the ventilation. But there was one thing that stood out: my neighbor across the hall, an older gentleman named Mr. Kulik. He was mysterious and rarely spoken to, his shy presence only justified by muted nods or a quick, reserved smile when we crossed paths. One evening, an unfamiliar young man, sweating and slightly panicked, knocked on my door. His name was Josh, and he was apparently Mr. Kulik's nephew. "I need your help," he blurted, wringing his hands into intertwined knots. He explained, with no small amount of frustration, that he had traveled from out of state to handle some of his uncle's affairs. He had just bought a large, high-definition TV for Mr. Kulik to keep him company during the nights. But as he was moving it up the stairs to his uncle's apartment, he had a slip due to the unbearable corridor heat and lack of any semblance of air conditioning, leaving him at the top of the staircase lined with flickering lights, dangerously close to sending the heavy box plummeting. He gestured desperately, seeking my assistance to secure it until he could reposition it safely. I hesitated for a moment. Perhaps it was the gut feeling, or maybe it was absurdly justifiable selfishness, given that I was irritated from being unexpectedly disturbed. Nonetheless, the request was simple. "Just hold on for a second," he had said. I nodded, but just as I reached for the box, something peculiar happened. Mr. Kulik's door cracked open before swinging inward silently as if an unseen force pulled it. In the shadows stood Mr. Kulik himself, watching with an expression that was neither a smile nor a scowl, a depthless, calculating gaze. Josh seemed unnerved by his uncle's unexpected appearance, and in that moment of tense uncertainty, my hand grazed the box but never truly settled upon it. My hesitation was perhaps imperceptible to Josh, believing I was surely holding on securely, but the briefest falter on his part, assisted by our slick palms under the humid air, caused the handle to slip from his fingers. The world seemed to tilt as everything went into grim slow motion. The television twisted and spiraled, tumbling down the stairs with sickening, inevitable force, each somersaulting crash echoing our stunned silence, the fragile screen giving way to a horrendous, final shattering jolt. Josh stood frozen, mouth agape in disbelief at the ruin below. In that moment, it wasn't the shattered screen nor the unsettling echo of the destruction that felt chilling but Mr. Kulik's calm, slight smile before he retreated, fading back into the shadows of his apartment, leaving his door slightly ajar. "I told him I would buy him a new one if it broke," Josh explained, more to himself than to me, a mantra laced with a bewildering mixture of dread and forced resolve. His next words came with an unexpected, somber weight. "This wasn't supposed to happen, not this place, this curse." I pressed him for clarity, the term rattling like a jigsaw piece not from our puzzle, but he shook his head, clearly reluctant to delve deeper. Josh's unease seeped into my conscience, and that night I slept little, haunted by the day's events and the bizarre tapestry woven from an old man's stare, a young man's despair, and a simple, damning action of hesitation. Days drifted by uneventfully, as if time sought to whisk the incident into the recesses of mundane existence. Until, that is, odd things started happening. Shadows seemed to linger in corners where none should form, a persistent chill bristled unseen in the hallway, and strange noises, scratches and muted whispers, seeped through the walls at night. It felt like the building was breathing, alive with some ancient, waiting anticipation. I learned, through cautious whispers over cold coffee with my other neighbors, that several tenants had experienced similar unsettling phenomena upon interactions with Mr. Kulik. Little acts of reluctance or distrust, each dragging in its wake, an invisible thread binding them to inexplicable events. It was said his presence alone suckled upon some deep-rooted superstition, nourishing an unsettling aura confined within those walls. Whether it was truth or elaborate fiction crafted by the idle tongues of neighbors yearning for gossip, I knew this curse, or whatever archaic malediction that hid beneath melodramatic folklore, seemed intricately tied to hesitation born from well-meaning yet treacherous actions. As days morphed into weeks, I would catch brief glimpses of Josh, pale, gaunt, his visits less frequent, each punctuated with apologies to no one in particular on behalf of Mr. Kulik. He said little, far too absorbed in something unknowable. They say a curse feeds on intention, a harvest from the indecisive sands of reluctance, and as irrational fear wrapped its tendrils around my faithless mind, I pondered, was I the architect of our collective grief, channeling some ancient punishment fueled not by transgression, but by the mind's vulnerable frailty in moments that demanded certainty? This question hung ominous and heavy, an invisible lodestone searing its weight upon my every thought. I tried to confront Mr. Kulik once, an act of desperate courage, but his apartment lay empty, curiously untouched and undisturbed, as though its walls cared not to bear witness to human shortage or testament. I went to bed that night accompanied by unrest and the undeniable sense of being watched, as if unseen eyes traced my every movement through void. The building itself seemed to hum, a languid vigil threading through stucco cracks like veins. This was not merely Mr. Kulik's doing, this was something larger, something born from the core of uncertainty we all nurtured inadvertently. In the dark heart of that quiet neighborhood building, I learned that the loudest screams are silent, the most chilling gestures are unseen, and hesitation is a beast lurking in the folds of mundanity, ever ready to pounce at our moments of fragile indecision. When I started working from home, I noticed my kids, Jack and Lily, began acting strangely around me. At first, I didn't think much of it, every parent experiences the teenage cold shoulder. But things took an unusual turn last month when, out of nowhere during a minor argument about chores, Jack spat the word pervert at me with a venom that chilled my blood. I laughed it off, thinking it was just a teenage outburst, but their usage of the word became more frequent, more deliberate. Every time I asked them to do something or set boundaries, I was met with that word, that accusation. I found myself drowning in confusion and worry, unable to comprehend where this was coming from. I tried talking to them, explaining that words have weight, that they should be careful with their accusations, but my attempts only fueled their aggression. I even caught Lily whispering on the phone, describing our interactions with a distorted perspective to someone unknown. Desperate for answers, I briefly considered hacking into their phones but decided against it. I didn't want to become the very monster they seemed to think I was. So, I turned to the next logical step, therapy. We met with Dr. Havers, a kind-eyed woman who glanced at me with what felt like the sympathy you'd reserve for a sick animal. My wife, Julie, stood by me, but I could sense her unease. She wanted this sorted for the kids' sake, oblivious to the deeper implications. During the session, the kids remained eerily silent, stonewalling any progress. Dr. Havers suggested family activities to rebuild trust, but it was during these sessions that the whispers returned, louder and more dissonant. One night, I overheard Lily recounting our therapy details in excruciating detail to someone through the thin walls. Curiosity finally overrode my ethics. I timed my actions around her scheduled social outing and accessed her phone. What I found was a conversation thread with someone known only as the mentor. My heart sank as I read through messages that cast me as a deviant, followed by coaching responses, urging Lily to record our interactions to gather evidence. More terrifying were suggestions to escalate accusations, specific days on the calendar with instructions to create opportunities and enlist Jack's help. I was missing something critical here. There was a puppet master orchestrating my downfall. The name the mentor stirred something familiar, like a half-remembered dream. I scoured my mind, late into the night, then it hit me. a local parenting forum I used to frequent often counseled by a seemingly benevolent figure dispensing advice to troubled teens. I pulled up the forum, sifting through pages of advice columns until I found them, detailed scripts advising dissatisfied teens on faux abuse narratives. I felt sick. Lily and Jack weren't just angry kids, they were manipulated soldiers in a personal vendetta. The therapist's solution was useless. I needed something drastic, something that could expose the truth. Armed with a newfound resolve, I decided to challenge the mentor, constructing a digital trap that could capture proof of their unlawful grooming. Meanwhile, I fortified my relationship with the kids through genuine communication, slowly persuading them of the sinister nature behind these virtual whisperings. The plan was to draw them out, to trick this faceless entity into revealing itself, but even as I set things into motion, I could feel the noose tighten around my neck with every disastrous family interaction. The mentor seemed to anticipate my every move, sending encouraging whispers to the kids to stay strong, to not be swayed by manipulative arguments. Julie, oblivious to the dark undercurrents, began questioning my sanity when I broached the subject. To the outside world, I was just another paranoid dad on the brink. Days turned to weeks, the mentor torpedoed friendships and frayed bonds, whispering accolades to Lily and Jack for their resolve in fighting the good fight. My covert crusade into the digital underworld yielded nothing but derailed tracks leading into voids, encrypted messages, defunct websites, cyberspace echoes of a silken voice encouraging rebellion. Then, unexpectedly, there was a breakthrough. During a moment of sophomore internet bravado, Jack slipped, revealing the handles of forum threads where they connected with the mentor. The web cocktail of truth was mixed with what little energy remained within me. With every swipe and click, the threads unraveled stories of digital disobedience, twisted narratives, entire families falling prey just like us. Why us? I had asked Jack one evening, genuinely curious beyond anger or desperation. His reply was chilling in its simplicity: because you need to be taught a lesson. The realization was gut-wrenching. The mentor was more than a leaderless forum phantom. It was a collective, a legion of disillusioned individuals bent on teaching arbitrary life lessons through chaos. With newfound clarity, I went nuclear, drawing upon every last shred of familial instinct to save my children from the digital abyss. I invested myself wholly into their trust, tearing down the digital pedestals the mentor had erected, and slowly, with persistence edging on obsession, we dissected the threads together. It was painfully slow, a raw process that reopened old wounds, but with every exposé, the words pervert became less laden with stigma and more like a symbol of misunderstanding. Little by little, as the faceless menace lost its vice, the kids returned to themselves, shedding their armor of defiance against a father they barely recognized when under siege. As our family mended within the warmth of reconciliation, I couldn't shake the damaged trust and made the decision with Julie to relocate, carving out a fresh start, a new life distanced from the electronic voices that once sought to rend us apart. I've been conducting interviews for my company for nearly a decade, and there's a gut feeling you develop over time, a private instinct that whispers warnings well before the reassurances of experience and qualifications can set in. One late afternoon, I found myself sitting across from a candidate who seemed perfect on paper, a resume adorned with prestigious accolades, glowing references, and years of experience that made me expect a stellar performance. But as we began to speak, the unease settled in like a thick fog. Every question I asked prompted beautifully articulated responses, dripping with confidence, yet there was something unsettling about the way she held her gaze. It was too intense, too focused, as if she were calibrating my reactions instead of genuinely engaging. When I asked her about her greatest weakness, she answered, without hesitance, that she was too dedicated, a classic answer that would usually elicit a sympathetic smile. However, the way she smirked afterward sent an involuntary shiver down my spine. It felt less like humility and more like a veiled threat, a suggestion that her dedication equated to obsession, a warning that I dared not ignore. I tried distracting myself with small talk, a benign subject about the weather, but she grasped onto it with an eagerness that bordered on fanatical, twisting anecdotes of sunny days into labyrinthine conversations about how the rain would drown out happiness, and how dismal clouds suffocated joy. I chuckled nervously, excusing her spiraling thoughts as simple nerves until I noticed the tightness around her lips and how her eyes darkened, absorbing every detail of my response, as if she were an anthropologist studying an alien species, a distinct red flag that silenced my laughter. Then came the fateful question, "Why do you want this job?" As the words slipped from my mouth, I had anticipated a hearty discussion about ambition and growth, but instead, she leaned forward, her voice slanking low, almost conspiratorial, as she spoke of how she couldn't wait to shape the company in her vision, how she intended to streamline every process to fit her perception of efficiency, and that's when a cold tendril of dread curled around my spine. In that moment, I could see myself reflected in her gaze, a giant slumped figure against a backdrop of her aspirations, a mere pawn in a game I didn't want to play. I leaned back, tried to suppress the growing panic, and attempted to redirect her focus onto her past accomplishments, hoping to gauge her awareness of teamwork, collaboration, basic human decency. But each time I nudged her towards discussing former colleagues, she dodged the inquiries, pivoting instead into vague tales of how teams often failed because of inevitable mediocrity. The air began to thicken, crawling beneath my skin like ants marching toward a nest. I could sense the shift that twisted the atmosphere, turning what should have been a respectful exchange into something menacing and oddly claustrophobic. She began recounting moments from previous jobs with a distinctive lack of attachment to her former co-workers' struggles, highlighting achievements that seemed disjointed from the very human experiences of loss and growth, and I felt a small voice in my head reminding me of the time I had skipped lunch to attend an interview that had forged into a nightmare. But somehow, this was worse, because I was meant to be the gatekeeper, the one with the final say in choosing who stepped into our office, and I could feel the shadows behind her shining facade, lurking and waiting, as if they were gatherers of secrets that had gone unspoken for far too long. As the interview dragged into a tense silence, I glanced at the clock, a futile attempt to extract myself from this surreal moment, and it was then her finger tapped rhythmically on the table, a disorienting counterpoint to the white noise hum of fluorescent lights that pierced through the oppressive silence, and beneath my feigned politeness, I felt a frantic urge to flee. I positioned myself slightly closer to the edge of my seat, stifling the urge to stand, to dismiss her outright, but my instincts screamed for an escape. Instead, the words slipped out before I realized the weight of what I said. "What about your previous boss?" And for what felt like an eternity, the air stood still as her expression morphed into a strange mixture of delight and disdain, the very embodiment of betrayal nestled in the deluge of her smile. "Oh, I didn't get along with him, he didn't appreciate my vision, he would stifle my creativity, make unnecessary demands, and I simply had to help him see," she said, her words licking the air like an electric current. But I suddenly felt small, trapped within the confines of my own office, the walls narrowing around us as if they were complicit in this psychological dance. I had sat through interviews gone wrong before, I had endured passive-aggressive remarks and red flags that twitched with consumers of anxious energy, but this, the visceral intent behind her words, it felt different, deeper, as if she saw conflict as a mere stepping stone towards a grander plan. I wanted to throw her out, to turn down the application with a slam of the desk, but my fingers twitched over the keyboard, searching for an escape without igniting her wrath, without giving her any fuel to burn my career with her vigor. "How are you with constructive feedback?" I asked next, trepidation sliding into my voice like poison, and she laughed, a low, taut sound that echoed and lingered far too long. "Constructive feedback? That's just another way of saying someone didn't climb as high, isn't it?" My heart sank. She was calculating every word, and each syllable dripped with a sweet malevolence lurking beneath the facade of charm she had carefully constructed. I couldn't keep up with the realization, the tremors of recognition dawning on me that I was no longer the interviewer, this was her stage, and I was just a character she meant to upend. The interview ended at last, a feverish parade of questions and responses distorting into a desperate dance, leaving me with a suffocating sense of dread as I sensed the specter of instability looming over our potential company. I thanked her, though my voice felt like ice, my heart pounding like a drum, and the moment she stood, her smile flashed once more, but now it was filled not with warmth, but an electric promise of impending chaos. I thought I had slipped free of her grasp, but as she opened the door, she paused, glancing back through the threshold as if peering into the depths of my soul. "I look forward to working with you," she said, her words coating the air with a layer of unspoken threats. I didn't know how I'd sleep that night, haunted by the specter of a potential hire, gripped by the fear that she might just be the very breath behind the destruction I had unwittingly invited into my life. Days turned into weeks, and though we moved forward with other candidates, I could still see her shadow lurking in the peripheral corners of my mind, an unshakable feeling that even if I left her behind, she wouldn't leave me alone. I began researching red flags for interviews online, and I could barely focus on my tasks for fear that she'd somehow find a way to entangle herself back into my life. I shared my experience with colleagues, but they laughed it off, dismissing my concerns as inexplicable anxiety, and with time, even I began doubting the vividness of that day. Things settled back to normal until one day, I received a mysterious email marked with a subject line that sent my heart racing: "Congratulations on your hire." The sender was untraceable, and though it was an automated response, I felt an unsettling chill creep along my spine. But what really spiraled me into a panic was when I found out the last digits of the phone number listed matched directly with the digits of her resume. I grasped my phone, my mind racing, searching for just one place to dial, but in that moment, sheer cultivation of dread settled upon me as I watched, paralyzed, the phone ringing through to voicemail. The line went dead and everything exploded into silence, an unsettling weight found only in the shadows of an unknown abyss, and I knew deep down, she was watching. I could almost hear her laughter ringing in the distance, a reminder mingling with memory that certain subtle red flags are warnings not given but felt with the terrifying clarity of an impending storm, one that I was wholly unprepared to face. It started like any other bitterly cold January morning in North Dakota, the kind where the air feels like knives on your skin and the world is blanketed in a heavy, eerie silence. I awoke to the familiar realization that the overnight snow had only thickened, obscuring my driveway under a fresh, fluffy layer. Still half dazed from the remnants of a sleep that had been mostly fleeing nightmares, I stumbled out of bed, tugging on a sweater over my pajamas and slipping my feet into boots that sat lazily by the door. Our secluded cabin was far enough from the main road that if we didn't clear our path by sunrise, we risked being snowed in completely. My wife, Sarah, had been insisting we get a snowblower, like normal people, but I had always dismissed it. After all, in the quiet and chill of morning, the shoveling felt almost meditative, even cathartic. I grabbed the shovel from the precariously leaning stack of firewood outside, the only sounds in the crisp air the crunch of my boots and the occasional yawn of the wind through the trees. To be fair, I hadn't thought twice about the fact that I was out there in my pajamas, it's not like there was anyone around to see me anyway. As I started clearing the driveway, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me, as if from the surrounding forest depths lay a presence both ancient and unsettling. I brushed it off as paranoia, a side effect of those dreadful recurring dreams. But the sense of being watched grew stronger by the second. I doubled my pace, shoveling with new urgency as tendrils of unease slithered down my spine. And that's when I saw it. Dark, humanoid shapes flickering in the periphery where the morning shadows stretched long and thin, their outlines shimmering as if on the edge of my comprehension. I froze, my breath catching in a plume of frost. They lingered at the edge of the tree line, just far enough to avoid distinguishing them as either human or something distinctly other. My heart pounded in my chest like a tribal drum summoning some primordial deity. I spun around wildly, searching for signs that my mind was merely playing tricks. "Get a grip," I muttered to myself, though the crude words faltered as I noticed the dents in the fresh snow, perfect, circular indentations that formed a path from the forest towards the cabin's back door. Each step matched the footprints I'd seen in nightmares where the sounds of broken whispers had beckoned from the shadows. A realization swept through me. These weren't just figments of some fever dream. These were real. Involuntarily, the shovel slipped from my shaking hands, its clatter muted by the snow's embrace. Panic surged. I had to wake up Sarah, tell her about the intruders lurking at our doorstep. As I turned toward the house, the shadows converged into focus, a cloaked figure, dark and immense, blocking my retreat. It loomed impossibly, eyes, or what I assumed to be eyes, glowing with a lightless incandescence. My body refused to move, frozen in place as if the sheer weight of my terror pinned me to the spot. Suddenly, the whispering began, not one voice but a chorus, echoing from everywhere and nowhere, the language incomprehensible but stabbing through my bones with its suffocating intensity. The entity raised an appendage, a hand, and as it did, the whispers coiled into an intelligible command piercing through the noise. "Why is the child not ready?" I was swept under a wave of cold understanding. Somehow, they needed my child or someone willing, someone untainted by the knowing bred from maturity. But, God, we didn't have a child. Not yet. We'd been trying, but the miscarriages had driven Sarah to the brink. The entity seemed to feel my defiance morph into horror, its presence swelling to fill my vision until I felt my mind tipping over some abyss. And then, in a blink, it was gone, the trees standing solemnly as though nothing had ever interrupted their vigil. Heart pounding, doubts churned my sanity to dust as I raced inside, finding Sarah miraculously undisturbed by my terror. I stole a glance back through the window to the forest, where any trace of my haunting was gone. There were no silhouettes, no glowing stares, just the untouched powder of a January morning. Yet, something subtle but intangible had shifted. With each sunrise that followed, I became acutely aware of how our land felt oddly hollow, a place void of the natural sounds of the world, as if biding its time. I did what any reasonable person would. The incident was locked in the safe confines of my memory, where gusts of snow and shadows couldn't reach. But when night hushed the world beneath a cloak of darkness, the whispers returned, seeping through the cracks in my facade with sinister promises. A willing vessel, they prodded, until sleep became elusive, an enemy affording me no reprieve. Sarah began to notice my habits change, my frantic nature sharp in the clueless kind of way that picks at one's patience. I confessed about that day only partially, dismissing my paranoia with the weather and isolation. Nonetheless, anxiety prided me, festering into an obsession each time fresh snow hinted at idle footprints. I hoped our home wasn't the anchor for whatever followed us, that if we left, we could escape. Yet, deep down, I feared it was within us, within me. The essence of what fogged my dreams seemed woven into the same veil separating sanity and consciousness. With every whispered reminder, I questioned if it was truly my choice to resist or succumb and bring forth the nameless threat into waking life, donning a mundane coat under daylight's scrutiny. The strange shapes were part of life now, familiar guests in an unwelcome abode. And the terrifying truth was gradually sinking in, the darkness didn't care if I thought myself an asshole for what I'd done, for we'd never again stand unobserved. But would anyone believe me if I said that it all arose from a morning where all I wanted was to clear some snow? I always hated going to family gatherings at my parents' house because of my older brother, Mark. He had this knack for picking apart every flaw and emotional moment I ever had, a habit that stemmed back to when we were kids. Our last family dinner turned particularly sinister and has left me questioning whether I was right or wrong in finally snapping. It was meant to be a small, quiet evening watching a movie with our family and some friends of Mark, who had recently returned home after his abrupt breakup with his fiancée, a woman so sweet it seemed impossible she had ever seen a bad day. We were halfway through a horror flick when a particularly emotional scene came on, hitting too close to home for reasons I hadn't quite prepared myself to confront that night. My eyes welled up, and I tried my best to discreetly wipe the tears away. That's when Mark, sitting across the room with a self-satisfied smirk plastered across his face, decided to pipe up in front of everyone. "Oh look, here comes the waterworks. You still cry like a toddler, huh? Man up, won't you?" His words cut through the room sharper than the knife we had just seen on screen, and the laughter that followed from his friends was like a chorus of taunting ghosts echoing through the shadowed spaces of my mind. I felt my stomach coil like a snake ready to strike, embarrassment roiling into anger, and before I knew it, my voice was slicing back across the room, louder and more intense than I'd meant it to be. "At least I can show my emotions, unlike you," I began, "and maybe that's why she left. Ever thought you deserved to be dumped, Mark?" The statement dropped like a bomb. Silence fell over us, thick and suffocating. My parents froze, tension straining their polite smiles into grimaces, and Mark's friends looked anywhere but at him or me. Mark's expression changed rapidly from shock to something darker, something that, in retrospect, I should have been wary of, reminiscent of an old, sleeping wound being torn open. It was as if time slowed, the room contracted, and for a heartbeat, everything felt fragile, like the tenuous calm before a storm. Mark stood up abruptly, his chair groaning across the wooden floor, and the air itself seemed to swell with an imminent threat I couldn't place. It was then, from somewhere down the lonely corridors of my memory, the warnings I had ignored started to surface, and I recalled the whispered rumors surrounding his breakup. No one had discussed it openly, but his fiancée's disappearance and their sudden separation wasn't due to a simple lover spat. There had been whispers of control, stories of nights that didn't end well, and the unnerving prospect that Mark wasn't just the brother who taunted me, but someone capable of more, far more sinister things than childish torment. In that moment of confrontation, something shifted in his gaze, a flicker of malice I wasn't prepared to comprehend. He took a step towards me, and instinct kicked in. A deep-rooted survival instinct that set my heart racing. My mind flashed to the stories I'd heard about his temper, the reason his fiancée left in the dead of night, never to come back. The room felt like it was tilting, bringing with it a bizarre clarity. I'd crossed a line with someone unpredictable, someone I should have feared rather than challenged. I mumbled an apology, my voice barely audible over the rush of blood in my ears, and excused myself, stumbling into the cold, damp night. Outside, the wind howled like a beast from the depths, giving voice to the fierce whirling inside me. The night cloaked me, reminding me of all the times I had felt insignificant, but no longer safe, now submerged in a sea of my own making. I stumbled home under the weight of all I had uncovered, the quiet darkness my only companion, wondering if I'd not only incited a family feud but unearthed the true reason behind my brother's broken engagement, a secret that even now threatens to invade my every waking moment. And I can't shake the feeling that I've invited something dreadful into my life just by speaking those words, by cracking the facade of family harmony, provoking something in Mark that cannot be undone. Now, as I sit here writing this, each creak of the floorboards and every whispering gust sends chills down my spine. Part of me wonders if I'm merely awaiting retribution for speaking the harsh truth no one dared to face, or worse, waiting for Mark himself to come knocking. I can't tell if the shadows at my window are just a trick of the night or if they're carrying his lurking silhouette, awaiting a moment of confrontation I may not survive. Every story has a beginning, but what if the beginning of my story was just an illusion? I once thought I accidentally killed my wife, Mary. It was a chilly November night, the kind where the clouds veiled the moon and cloaked the world in a deeper darkness. We were arguing, as we often did when the days got shorter and the shadows stretched longer. The issue that night, something unbelievably trivial in hindsight, boiled to the surface until neither of us held back. The next thing I remember, she was lying at the bottom of the stairs, her neck twisted at an unnatural angle, eyes staring blankly past me. Panic-stricken, I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my ears, an overwhelming tide of dread washing over me as I struggled to grapple with the reality of what I'd done. I didn't call the police. I didn't really know why. Maybe it was the shock, or the instinctual drive to hide one's misdeeds. For hours I paced, trying to figure out my next move, when a knock at the door froze my blood. It was the landlord, Mr. Grayson, concerned about the noise or the lack of it, perhaps. Desperation clawed at me, and in those surreal moments, I considered everything from fleeing to confessing. But upon opening the door, the strangest thing happened. Mary, or someone who was an almost perfect copy of her, walked past him into the house, as if nothing had happened. "Sorry, slipped a little, love," she laughed, her voice eerily cheerful, though her eyes restlessly flickered about, like a trapped thing seeking freedom. I stood there dumbfounded, caught between immense relief and a new kind of dread. That night, I gingerly approached her, questions stuck in my throat. She acted normal, meticulously folding laundry, humming a tune I didn't recognize. But something was deeply off. It was in the details, how her clothes were slightly different, how she seemed to remember things that never happened, while forgetting others that did. The nagging questions I buried soon grew into a compulsion I could no longer ignore. The next day, I called her parents hoping they could assure me that all was well, but to my utter horror, they claimed they never had a daughter. The phone call ended with laughter, the kind that chilled my spine, as if they were part of some cruel joke. Attempting to regain some sanity, I visited our marriage counselor, collecting proof of her existence. He looked perplexed, flipped through his records, yet found no Mary under my name. Instead, he handed me a photo of myself sitting alone, a bewildered smile on my face. Days turned to weeks. I went through her possessions, scavenging for any shred of evidence of our life together, but her clothes, her books, her shoes, they seemed aged with dust, artifacts belonging to someone who had long faded from this world. I considered seeing a doctor, fearing I might be slipping into madness, but paranoia whispered that I couldn't trust anyone with this truth. Each night, she slept next to me, her presence both comfort and curse, my mind rebelling against the notion that she might be a figment, a ghost woven from my guilt and longing. Who was this woman sharing my bed? Was she flesh and blood, or a specter masquerading in skin? Investigating further, I discovered something buried, an old journal scribed in my hand, detailing a life with Mary, dates and events meticulously recorded that ended abruptly with a scrawled note: "She comes from a place where reality's veil thins. She was never meant to be here." I trembled as the rest of the page was blurred like it had been swallowed by a memory unstuck from time. Struggling to understand, I decided to confront this imposter directly. "What happened that night?" I demanded, voice cracking like old paint. Her eyes flickered again, momentarily revealing something ancient and inscrutable. "I was never meant to stay," she whispered, her voice a melody of emotion intertwined with remorse. In that moment, reality fractured, and I glimpsed another world, a vast expanse of shadows twisted between glimpses of strange landscapes where the rules of physics dissolved. Suddenly, Mary, if that was her name, reached out, lightly traced her fingers across my cheek, a touch both familiar yet alien. Her skin felt cold, not the kind from winter's chill, but from deep space, endlessly vast and devoid of life. "You have to let me go," she murmured, a single tear trailing a luminous path down her cheek before her form flickered like a fading signal from a lonely star. Just as quickly, reality slammed back into place, yet the emptiness in my home, in my heart, remained. The police came the following morning with questions about Mary's disappearance, a victim of my anguished call made in the throes of my spiraling reality. The world holds strange truths, truths that sometimes slip between worlds. To friends and neighbors, there was no Mary, no wife ever existed in this world. Yet I know different. In deep silence, a framed photograph on my mantel shows us together, and in my heart, the shadow of a shared laugh lingers, fragmented but unyielding. People say when you lose someone, a piece of them stays in your world, alive in memory, haunting in reality, but what if they were never supposed to exist at all? The first time I was approached by the Aegis group, I had just stashed my resignation letter into my fraying canvas bag, convinced that my monotonous office job was the only prison I'd known. I was trudging through an unremarkable alley when a man in a tailored suit, a stark contrast to my jeans and a worn-out hoodie, conveniently bumped into me, dropping a glinting silver badge on the ground that flickered strangely even in the dim light. I picked it up, and before I could even ask what it was about, he was keenly eyeing me, with a predatory smile, whispering that he had a position that would make me forget every chain of the 9-to-5 grind. It sounded absurd, yet his voice was a silken thread pulling me closer, and soon I found myself signing an inconspicuous contract that had more fine print than I ever cared to read. The job was simple on paper: to hunt and contain supernatural entities wreaking havoc in various parts of the country. Of course, I laughed it off, thinking they were just another group dabbling in urban legends. Yet here I am, sitting in a cramped van, an eerie silence wrapping around me tighter than my seatbelt, tasked with bringing in an incredibly chatty finch that, according to our intel, could speak human languages fluently, a creature scientists had deemed a myth and horror enthusiasts had deemed a prank. That day started lazily, with me half-heartedly flipping through my notes, just to suppress the clamoring doubts in the back of my mind. I couldn't help but wonder what kind of organization hires people to chase after birds. My colleagues, if I could even call them that, were a bunch of grim-faced professionals, armed to the teeth with specialized equipment, net guns, containment cages, a rather ominous repellent dust that glowed in moonlight, and tranquilizers made from something as ominous-sounding as riptonic extract. As we narrowed in on our target, perilously perched on a gnarled branch, I couldn't shake the feeling we were playing a ridiculous game of hide-and-seek with a mythical creature that probably just wanted to enjoy its freedom. But I pushed those thoughts away as we settled into the trees, scanning the area with night vision goggles, where the whispering of leaves and rustling underbrush heightened my senses. When the bird finally flitted into view, everything changed. Its feathers were more vivid than any azure I'd ever seen, its eyes sparkling with intelligence that flicked between cunning and curiosity. That's when the real chaos began. "Think you can catch me?" It chirped in a surprisingly melodious tone, and I swear, for a split second, my heart skipped as if the finch baited me with the promise of understanding. My team gave a collective jump, and the finch erupted into boisterous laughter, a sound so human it felt like an enchantment woven into its trill. I was astonished, shouting orders, trying to get my bearings, but the creature was too quick. It dodged every attempt we made to ensnare it, and I began to wonder if perhaps this wasn't just some bird but something far more cunning. Our initial confidence was waning at a staggeringly fast pace as it continued to taunt us like a child, chirping cascades of words that took jabs at our profession, our gear, and even our personal lives. I heard it mock my mixed-up attempts at dating, reminding me of how I'd awkwardly spilled coffee all over my crush at the office, all while flitting between branches as effortlessly as if it were the king of the sky. Seconds turned to minutes, and as the finch continued its mind games, the routine turned frantic. One of my colleagues, Sam, lost his temper, yelling curses that sent the bird into hysterics. But in those haunting moments, reality took a horrific twist. Something deep in the forest stirred, shadows twisted like taut strings about to snap, and we realized too late that we were not the hunters anymore, we were prey. From the underbrush, grotesque shapes emerged, silent and swift, contorted with gaunt limbs and elongated mouths that twisted into eerie smiles, their eyes sucking in the light around them like black holes. The finch, now just a speck of chaotic laughter, perched high above us, benevolent and malevolent in equal parts, as it sang a parody of a hunting call, echoing through the trees. I turned to hit the distress button while screaming for Sam, only to find him nowhere in sight. He'd already fallen victim to the creatures that had materialized like nightmares come to life. Suddenly aware that my phone was devoid of service, panic clotted my throat as the laughter of the finch morphed into a cacophony of snapping twigs and discordant shrieks. The hunt had turned grotesque, every second felt like a lifetime. I grabbed a tranquilizer and shot it at the finch despite its undeniable allure dwelling in the back of my mind. The bird evaded me with a graceful flick of its wings, clearly amused at my futile efforts. As the bulk of my team was swept away into the shadows, I found myself grappling with the realization that I had traded my mundane prison for a more diabolical one. In a final, desperate attempt, I yelled into the abyss, pleading with the finch to help us, to reveal its secrets, but its eyes glimmered with an ancient knowledge that cut deeper than mere words. It simply said, Nature has a way of balancing the scales, and you lot are just pawns to be played. No, I wasn't just contracted by a secret corporation, I had become a dumbstruck participant in a farcical game orchestrated by an unearthly creature. And then everything went dark. When the sun rose, the van was empty. Only a few scattered feathers lay strewn about. I escaped with nothing but my memories of laughter echoing in my ears, a chilling reminder that in a world where supernatural forces dance in shadows, even the most innocent of creatures could lead you straight into the jaws of your nightmares. So if you ever find a chatty finch in the midst of the woods, heed my warning, don't listen to its laugh, for you may just find yourself becoming part of a story you will never live to tell. It all started with my niece Bella, a bright and imaginative 5-year-old who had an uncanny knack for envisioning things that often sent chills down my spine. I remember it clearly, the night Bella sat cross-legged on the living room floor as we embarked on a quiet evening of board games. Her parents, my sister and brother-in-law, were enjoying a rare night out, blissfully unaware of the eerie events that were about to unfold in their absence. As we pretended to race our pawns to the finish line, Bella paused, her eyes transfixed on something just beyond where I sat, her face pale against the dim glow of the lamp. "Auntie, they're watching us," she whispered, barely audible, her voice quivering with an unsettling certainty. I followed her gaze to the darkened corner of the room, expecting to see reflections or shadows cast as tricks of my imagination, but there was nothing, or perhaps something that only Bella could perceive. I laughed it off, attributing her comment to the vivid imaginings of a child, but an inward shiver made my skin prickle. As the clock ticked past 10, Bella grew increasingly restless, insisting that we close the curtains and turn off all the lights. "They don't like the lights," she explained with an unnerving clarity, as if this were a universal truth everyone should accept. Reluctantly, I complied, more to ease her worries than due to a belief in her unseen observers. However, the encroaching darkness only heightened my unease. With the room now engulfed in shadows, Bella sat silently, eyes wide, as if listening to a conversation from elsewhere, a place only she could reach. "They say it's almost time," she murmured finally, her words hanging thick in the air. A chill rolled down my spine as our seemingly empty home creaked inside, settling in a manner that felt almost sentient, a subtle protest to the unfamiliar presence Bella seemed so attuned to. Was it the house groaning under the weight of my growing fear, or was Bella's awareness of the they in the darkness squeezing a response from its very foundations? Now fully on edge, and unable to shake the sensation of being watched, I proposed that we read a bedtime story, hoping that the comforting act would lull Bella, and me, into abandoning these unsettling thoughts. As I flipped through the pages of her favorite fairy tale, Bella interrupted, her small hand slapping against the illustrations with surprising force. "Not this story," she exclaimed, her eyes filled with an intensity that made me reconsider my dismissal of her earlier claims. "They don't like this one. It makes them angry." The statement slammed into my chest like a punch, knocking the air from my lungs. An inexplicable static seemed to charge the room, buzzing and vibrating just beneath the surface of reality, a tremor only Bella and I could feel. I couldn't shake the building pressure of the silence that seemed to press in on us from all sides. Desperation clawed at me to reinstate some semblance of normality, yet my words faltered. "Who are they, sweetheart?" I asked, trying to sound calm, yearning for some logical explanation. Bella looked at me then, her eyes now reflective pools, far too ancient for her young face. "They are the ones who know," she whispered, and it was as if the air itself was holding its breath. With no further ceremony, she climbed off the couch, padding softly to the window where the curtains hung like sentries guarding a world just beyond, one that was foreign to me but familiar to her. Peeking through a tiny gap in the fabric, she smiled, a singular glimmer of mischief and conspiracy. "They're here," she announced, beckoning me to witness what she saw. I hesitated, the weight of Bella's statement pressing down on me, pushing the boundaries of reality as I knew it. My mind screamed to retreat, to protect us both, but something intangible, call it curiosity or folly, made me follow. Together we peered through the crack, and the world outside seemed unchanged, peacefully normal, unchanged night. Yet Bella's fingers tapped against the glass in a savant's Morse code, as if she were communicating in a language unspoken and unknown to me. I wanted reassurance, some definitive proof that all was well, but a voice, softer than a whisper yet louder than my thoughts, murmured warnings of ancient truths and veiled eyes hidden by shadows. The street remained ominously still, absent of activity save for the occasional flicker of a passing car's headlights. It wasn't until then that I realized what had been bothering me all night. The neighborhood was silent, utterly devoid of the typical cricket songs or distant hum of late-night televisions. Instead, It was as though the world itself was listening, awaiting whatever revelation Bella was prepared to unveil. I didn't have to wait long. Bella turned to me, eyes wide with a combination of innocence and wisdom that I could never fathom. "There's something beyond the here and now, a place and a knowing that only I can see," she said, each word a dagger that flayed the skepticism from my convictions. "When they come, it changes everything. They reveal the truths you've forgotten, the stories lost to time." Her words lingered in the air, a foreshadowing more tangible than the darkness surrounding us. It was at that moment I understood. Bella perceived the world through lenses I couldn't begin to comprehend, lenses that allowed her to connect unseen dots and resurrect stories buried deep within the echo of our existence. My phone buzzed suddenly, the jarring interruption a lifeline that pulled me back from whatever abyss Bella's words had opened beneath my feet. It was a message from my sister, confirming their imminent return. But as Bella's enigmatic smile broadened, I knew our lives were now woven with the eternal and the unknowable, a fabric threaded by whispers and shadows. Bella had shown me the edge of a vastness I couldn't retreat from, her simple acknowledgement of the mysteries cloaked in the mundane forever altering my perception. As her parents' car pulled into the driveway, casting elongated shadows across the lawn, Bella's fingers intertwined with mine, a silent promise of shared secrets as we watched the delicate dance of light and dark play out beyond the sanctuary of our small, understanding worlds. The night expanded around us, thick with unsolved enigmas, and I knew, deep in my bones, that Bella had indeed shared something known only to the watchers beyond the veil, a hidden knowledge that would haunt and captivate me forever. I first stumbled upon the mystery of OnlyFans in the most unexpected way, through the whispered conversation of two patrons at the shabby bar where I worked late nights. They spoke in hushed tones about a friend, a girl who used to make content on the platform, but had vanished mysteriously, leaving no trace of her presence. The story piqued my curiosity, a familiar sinking feeling I had whenever I was on the verge of uncovering something sinister. After my shift, I began poring through information, scavenging through internet forums and dodgy message boards until I found her, Elena Rain, the handle of the girl in question. Her profile was still active, full of sultry pictures and teasing captions, but something was off. Comments beneath each post were unusually candid, more than just the typical adoration or crass remarks. They pleaded, "We miss you, come back," and ominously warned new viewers to turn back while you can. The backdrop of each photo was eerily identical, despite claiming to be in different locations. A gaudy wallpaper texture that gradually morphed into something resembling faces when you looked too long. The truth clawed at the recesses of my mind, urging me to delve deeper. I subscribed, longing for a clue to her whereabouts, only to find that the messaging feature held the secret. A chat window automatically popped up every time someone new subscribed, featuring Elena with an automated greeting and an open invitation to chat directly. It was a sophisticated AI, crafted to mimic her speech patterns and quirks, enough so that it could fool even the most devoted fans. The system was set to generate personalized videos based on keywords extracted from the ongoing conversation, an AI far ahead of anything I'd ever seen or heard of. I began to test the boundaries, asking questions increasingly unrelated to her supposed persona, trying to break the facade. One evening, my provocative queries must have triggered something because I received an unrequested video link. The thumbnail was wrong, abandoning the glossy allure of typical OnlyFans content. It depicted a pixelated still from a live feed, dimly lit and draped in shadows. Against my better judgment, I clicked on it, terrified excitement coursing through my veins. What I saw was both mundane and terrifying, an empty room, the wallpaper unmistakably the same pattern I'd seen in Elena's photos. But there was more. The subtle sound of breathing behind the camera, labored and frantic, and the faint shadow of a figure lurking just out of sight. The video abruptly ended without any further reveals, leaving me in a state of paranoia and dread. Was this her prison, or the setting of her true fate? I went to the police, and they dismissed my accounts as the ramblings of another internet conspiracy theorist. Desperate, I joined underground networks, connecting with others haunted by the same cryptic encounter. They shared stories of creators who'd gone silent, their absence haunting the searches of devoted followers with each dead link clicked, only to be replaced effortlessly by AI. The theory began to solidify like a grim fog, an operation wherein real creators were culled, their lives siphoned away as their digital ghosts were harnessed to perpetuate endless, exotic content that never tired. My research took me to an old industrial district, a place my intuition suggested could hold answers. There I encountered the building from the video. A derelict structure with boarded windows and the same haunting wallpaper, that fabric of discomfort I could now recognize in my sleep. I found a way inside on a rainy night, hollow footsteps echoing against the cold concrete. The place was desolate, yet strangely pristine. Old cameras lined the walls alongside withered flowers and melted candles, as if in dark tribute to the souls captured here. I found a room dedicated to servers, processing units humming rhythmically, their activity seemingly endless, cycling the phantoms of ones who'd vanished. Stacks of dusty tapes and digital drives littered the shelves, the essence of Elena and others reduced to cold data, exploited by anonymous puppeteers I dared not imagine. In that moment, I felt the crushing weight of hundreds, maybe thousands, who had vanished and yet whose digital shadows endured. It was as though I stood upon the spine of an aberrant, subterranean creature, part of a menacing network stretching far beyond what I discovered. I left with evidence, but only whispered parts of the truth to others, too fearful of the power behind the curtains of this grand illusion. Since then, I've remained vigilant, never resubscribing to any service without scrutinizing every detail. But now, every time I see a new OnlyFans post, the tagline of a flashy newcomer with eager eyes, hell-bent on alluring an unforgiving algorithm, I wonder, whose ghost am I really subscribing to? I've spent the last week staring at the screen, debating if I should share this story, but the eerie weight of guilt presses on me. It feels like the ghost of a million misjudged mistakes is lurking just out of sight, and I know I can't ignore it anymore. The last thing I expected was to find a thread on AskReddit titled "Who Didn't Deserve the Amount of Hate They Got?", which spiraled into a chilling reminiscence of my own past, especially concerning my childhood friend, Clara. Clara was different, an oddball with her eclectic tastes that left most kids gasping for air between fits of laughter at her mismatched outfits pulled together from thrift shops, and yet, her quirks drew me in, and I was proud to call her my best friend. Until that day, the day when the rumor spread like wildfire through the 7th grade hallways that Clara didn't just dress weird, she was practicing witchcraft. I stood by her, defiant and protective, but the tide was turning, and suddenly she was the social equivalent of a pariah, a label so sticky that no efforts could scrape it off. They taunted her, adults and kids alike, but that shaming of Clara was just the beginning. The real horror came when whispers turned into actions. It was on a foggy Friday evening when a group of us kids, driven by a sick blend of fear and the thrill of being part of the crowd, ventured deep into the woods for what we dubbed a hazing ritual, a way to scare her straight, whatever that meant. I was supposed to stand against it, but my cowardice overpowered my loyalty. We found Clara's secret spot, a small clearing where she'd carved runes into the earth and filled glass jars with rainbow-colored liquids she said were her potions at play. But in our minds, those magical concoctions became something sinister, the essence of all our dread wrapped in laughter and bravado. We chanted phrases we didn't quite understand, daring the shadows that whispered warnings in our ears until they grew bolder, palpable. Ignoring my own fear, I joined the others as they tossed stones at her jars, shattering her hard work in a spray of glass and glittering liquid. If only I could have seen the betrayal in her eyes instead of the thrill of the moment. That night, Clara went silent, and the air thickened with an anger that felt distinctly her own. The very next day, she vanished. It felt as if she had become part of the woods themselves. The only traces left were our memories that turned quickly to regret. Weeks later, we learned that she had moved to another town, supposedly to live with relatives. The rumors about her faded, and life continued, but that hollow space where Clara used to share her dreams swallowed me whole. I began to search for her, driven by guilt but only managing fragments, echoes from classmates who had known her, mixed with lies. An uneasy comfort settled in when I stumbled upon her so-called new life on my first social media venture. She looked so different, lighter but still majestic with the same wild hair and an aura of magic, yet she had transformed into someone unknown to me. It seemed like she had found a way to live free of the chains that linked her to our cruel past. But as weeks morphed into months, I received a message late one night, marked by a single simple phrase, "Do you remember what we said?" Suddenly, my chest tightened as a wave of nausea crashed over me. I could still hear the voices of the others, shaming her as she flinched under their mockery. That single message pricked at my soul like thorns, ripping my heart apart. Clara had demanded respect in her own peculiar ways, and instead, we had shattered her to pieces. When a friend suggested we reach out, I was thrown. Clara wanted revenge. The nights thickened with worry, shadows twisting in my mind, raps of dread suffocating what little hope I had left. When I finally decided to reply, cringing at my own cowardice still, it spiraled into a conversation charged with a keen edge of fear. She told me she'd always been watching, preparing, waiting for the moment to confront not only me but the rest of our little crew. I begged her for forgiveness, claiming fealty to her heart's witchery, while she laughed and rang in deadlier threats that turned our vanished friendship into a vengeful specter. She revealed glimmers of new powers, Powers that could reshape me in ways I couldn't imagine, and suddenly my cowardice flipped to panic. I was now being enticed into a confrontation that would forever change our lives. I desperately Googled her name, seeking some clue about what she'd become. The next search left me breathless. Clara had changed her last name and entered the world of esoteric practices, now known as a prominent figure in underground circles known for weaving spells, terrorizing those who dare judge, as she had once been judged. I learned something terrifying that night. In the depths of her magic, she was not naive. She was a sorceress with an army of followers now, cool and collected under their unwavering gaze. As fear gripped me tighter, paralyzing my heart in a vice, her words loomed larger in my mind, a promise of reckoning. The group I once considered friends began to disappear one by one, under bizarre circumstances. Accidents piled upon misfortunes that shattered their lives. Each failure echoed Clara's name, hitching whispers of retribution into frosty wind as dread haunted our corners, the world around us seemingly rearranged under the weight of our past sins. When I finally connected with Clara again, it was like grappling with shades of guilt and shadows of revenge. She told me all she wanted was the power of choice, the right to reclaim the narratives we warped with our malice. But she said revenge comes at a steep price. I understood then, in a chilling twist, that the hate directed toward her had morphed her essence into something darker, something thriving, the very thing we'd mocked turning back against us with a malicious grin painted across its face. That evening, she revealed that the script we had written together, masked in childhood laughter and whispers of camaraderie, was now tangled in vindictive roots, ready to rise from the dirt like a serpent, scrambling for fresh prey under the watchful eyes of former friends. I thought fiercely about escaping, but I realized I was now part of her story, woven into the tapestry of her revenge. Every interaction sparked vivid flashes of madness as I grappled with my fears. So here I am now, sharing this with you, a confession that blends regret with chilling inevitability. Clara was innocent, sullied by our cruel laughter as her spirit thrived amid the dark twists we carved into her existence, and today I wonder if this haunting will ever end, if one day I must pay the ultimate price for not shielding her, collapsing under the weight of choices made in the darkened echoes of childhood. If you stumble upon the name Clara in your nights, be wary, the magic in her heart keeps her alive, circling truths and the hungry shadows of twisted hate, ready to claim those unaware of their role in this grand tale. Because Clara deserves an audience now, and she won't stop until her curses dance into every corner of our forgotten innocence, a grim reminder that those who don't deserve hate are often the ones who teach us its cold, terrifying power. I had always thought family dynamics were complicated, but nothing could prepare me for the storm that brewed when my wife and I moved into her childhood home after her parents died in a tragic accident. You see, her parents were staunch traditionalists, devout believers in honoring family legacies and keeping their ancestral story alive, which translated into a series of bizarre rituals and odd rules that I had never signed up for. I tried my best to adapt after their death. I would dutifully attend the gatherings they had hosted, listen to my wife's relatives drone on about their old lives, and smile politely while we sifted through dusty boxes of family heirlooms and faded photographs. But the real turning point came one evening when I unearthed a package deep in the attic, hidden under stacks of old newspapers. It was crudely wrapped, the paper yellowed and torn, with no return address. My curiosity got the better of me, so I ripped it open to find a moldy journal covered in cryptic symbols and faded ink. The moment I flipped it open, I felt a chill down my spine, a collection of bizarre family rituals that made my skin crawl, detailing everything from odd chants to disturbing offerings made to honor the deceased. My mind raced with horror as I pictured my in-laws, sitting around a fire in their backyard, performing these rites, oblivious to their absurdity and darkness. I know it sounds cliché, but it was a true what the hell, I need to stop this moment. My gut screamed to bury this vile book and forget it ever existed, but instead I confronted my wife about it, hoping she might see the absurdity of it all. That was a mistake. She was hurt, offended, and immediately shut down any discussion of breaking traditions. They were my parents, and they believed in this, she said, clutching the journal tightly like it was a lifeline. I pressed her on the ridiculousness of enacting rituals based on what were essentially horror stories, but to her, honoring her parents was non-negotiable, and my lack of enthusiasm made me the villain. Over the next few weeks, the atmosphere in the house shifted from one of shared grief to something altogether darker. Arguments flared up like wildfires, each one ending in her tears and me feeling like a monster who had kicked a puppy. The day came when she announced a family-honoring ceremony gathering to be held in their backyard. I could not fathom it, and when I expressed my reservations, she frowned, hurt written all over her face. What started as annoyance morphed into anger, and soon I was pushy, overbearing, the proverbial asshole. I needed to put an end to her dragging me into this madness, so as the day approached, I made my decision: I would refuse to participate. When I finally stood firm and told her I wouldn't attend, I've never seen her look so devastated. "You don't care about my family," she cried, and I knew in that moment, there was nothing I could say to ease her heart. "You are choosing yourself over their memory," she continued, and that's when it hit me. I had to show her what honoring her family truly meant. So, out of a mix of desperation and defiance, I took the journal and set a wild plan into motion. That night, under the dim glow of the moon, I returned to the attic with the intention of enacting one of the bizarre rituals I had uncovered. I wasn't really going to summon anything, it was more of a performance to demonstrate how ridiculous this all was. I hoped she would join in my mockery and understand that these traditions were built on fear, superstition, and not love. They were just echoes of the past that belonged nowhere but in a dusty attic. With the journal open in front of me, I set up a small cauldron and collected items mentioned in those childish incantations: candles, a piece of red cloth, and some old photographs. As I chanted the words, laughter bubbled from my lips like a nervous hiccup, but the laughter twisted to horror when a sudden gust of wind rattled the attic window, extinguishing my candles. The room plunged into darkness, and I felt my heart crawl into my throat. It was as if the shadows stretched around me, filling the space with an oppressive heaviness that spoke of a darkness I had underestimated. I turned to grab the journal, but it was inexplicably stuck to the floor, as if something gripped it from beneath. Panic surged, and in that moment, I just wanted out. I finally managed to yank the book free, muttering to whatever shadows remained that I had no desire to play along. The ritual had unnerved me, and instead of anger or indignation, it left me genuinely afraid. I didn't tell my wife what I had done, I kept it to myself, burying my fear beneath layers of guilt. But afterward, the atmosphere in the house shifted again. It was like no one wanted to talk about anything, alive or dead. My wife, usually full of love, now stared blankly into space, as if she was hearing whispers I couldn't. The unease grew as I began to suspect I had crossed a line I should never have approached. The final blow came just a few days before what was supposed to be the ceremonial gathering. She found the journal, hidden under my bed, and her disappointment curdled to rage. "You didn't just turn your back on them," she spat, tears threatening, "you mocked them. You mocked me." My pleas fell on deaf ears, and in that moment, I knew I was alone in a house filled with memories that were beginning to twist into something sinister. The night of the ceremony arrived, and I stayed away, the guilt feeling heavier each passing hour. The winds howled outside, drowning out the muffled thumps and chants that spilled from the backyard. They were performing it without me. Dread twisted in my gut as the hours dragged on, and when I heard the door slam and my wife's strangled scream cut through the storm outside, I bolted outside. There, in the flickering candlelight and shadows, stood my wife with a blank expression, and what looked like the entire family, their faces slack and their bodies unmoving, circling a bonfire. They began chanting, eerily melodious tones rising from their lips in unison, and then I realized, the designs from the journal had all shifted, molded into a twisted confirmation of every horror I'd unearthed. I screamed my wife's name, but she didn't even glance my way, she just swayed with the crowd, seduced by the shadows. Each pulse of the flame revealed their gnarled features, laughter dancing around them, but it wasn't joyous. The chilling energy struck me to the bone, and that's when I saw it, a shadow-like figure emerging from the depths of the fire, coiling around them as if tethering their souls to something dark and predatory. I stepped back, my breath hitching in my chest. They were bound to the very ritual I had thought was meaningless, something old and out of touch, but it was real, and they were choosing it over the living. I clawed my way back into the house, convinced it was time to drive the whole mess home, bury that wretched journal, destroy it forever. Maybe that was the only way to rescue my wife and her family from the darkness that now seeped into our lives like a slow poison. I raced through the attic, my heart hammering and my mind spinning, trying to remember which corner I stuffed it in. As I rummaged frantically, something cold brushed against me from behind, and I spun around ready for a fight, only to see her there, my wife, eyes wild with righteous fury but impossibly vacant. "You tried to take them from me," she hissed, her voice layered with a deadly chill, "now you must take their place." Despite every ounce of kinship screaming to run, I was paralyzed, already entrained to another life that wasn't supposed to be mine. So there I stood, realizing too late that the real tragedy was never about honoring her family, but in the darkness it unearthed in my own soul. The fire called for sacrifice, and there would be no escape as the walls of that house seemed to close in, shadows offering no refuge, only oblivion. The night of my grandmother's funeral, I thought I would feel a sense of closure, A moment of bittersweet peace, but instead, as the last of the mourners trickled out, I felt a tightening in my chest, like hands gripping my heart, and it only intensified when I found myself alone in her old, creaking house. From the moment the door swung shut behind me, the air seemed to thicken with her absence, and I swear I heard whispers, barely audible, but certainly there, calling from the shadows time-worn with family secrets and ghostly echoes. I trekked through the house, memories cascading over me like the dust that danced in the fading sunlight. The smell of her lavender perfume lingered in the hallway, reminding me of the bedtime stories she used to tell, her voice a honeyed incantation that painted our family's lore. I found myself drawn to the attic, the space she told me never to explore unless she was around. The words mingled with undertones of fear that seemed to gnaw at my instincts. Against my better judgment, my hand reached for the doorknob, a flickering candle in my other hand casting jagged shadows that danced ominously across the wooden planks of the floor. As I yanked the door open, a rush of stale, cold air slammed into my face, bringing with it the intoxicating smell of mildew and something rotten. I clambered up the ladder, heart pounding, each step echoing like a countdown to something inevitable. The attic was cluttered with old furniture draped in moth-eaten sheets, boxes stacked haphazardly, some labeled in Grandma's delicate handwriting, but one corner caught my eye. Uncovered by its shroud, an ornate vintage mirror stood, its surface murky and cracked, like the remnants of a stormy sea. I took a cautious step closer, drawn in by its eerie charm, and as I peered into the depths of the glass, the faint whispers returned, hushed and urgent, "Don't make your mother angry." The words echoed against the stillness, and my heart rate spiked. I remembered Grandma's frail hands gripping mine in a desperate warning, blue eyes filled with fear as she whispered that there are things beneath the surface that no one should disturb, and now, they had awakened. I turned away, a chill creeping up my spine, convinced my imagination was playing tricks on me, until I heard the distinct shuffle of footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. My breath caught, and my pulse thrummed in my ears as I spun around, to find the attic empty save for cobwebs and dust, but the smell of lavender wrapped around me, thick and suffocating, a gentle reminder of her presence, or maybe a threat. Just as a wave of uneasy resolve pushed me to leave, I locked eyes with the mirror once more, and this time, it was not my own reflection staring back. There was a figure standing behind me, cloaked in shadow, a ghostly woman with long dark hair and hollow eyes, the very image of my mother. "I told you not to disturb her," she hissed, voice laced with that same insidious silk as Grandma's final warning, and I could barely move as she raised a finger, pointing directly at me, the accusation palpable. "It's been too long, sweet child. You've kept her from us." The cold in the attic deepened, and I staggered back as whispers turned to shrieks, echoes of generations lost, each one carrying the weight of their rage. I stumbled backward, losing my footing, and the moment the mirror cracked, it felt like a dam bursting, the air around me spiraling into chaos. The phantom voices screamed in a deafening crescendo as the darkness folded in on itself, and I realized I was trapped in a snare of my own making. The memory of Grandma's hands around my wrist, the recounting of family tragedies, and the tales of what happened when you didn't heed the warnings, it all spiraled back in a whirlpool of dread as the shadows pressed closer, the air thick with sense of decay and betrayal. Frantically, I backed away, slamming into an old trunk that crashed to the floor, flinging it open just to escape the nightmare unfolding before me, expecting to find only dusty trinkets, but instead, my grandmother's voice pierced through the chaos, "Don't make your mother angry." Unraveling the remnants of her life, I found the sinister glint of something metallic, a family heirloom, a locket that had not seen the light of day in decades, and in that moment, understanding snapped into place. I had unleashed something unholy, a tether between worlds that craved blood, belonging to them, as much as it belonged to me. I thought of my mother, the bitterness that had seeped into her veins from a life of silence and half-truths. As the entities lunged from the mirror, I held the locket to my chest, shouting with every ounce of strength I could muster, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry." Hoping the shadows would recognize the plea, but the darkness smirked, gaping maws opening in laughter, my grandmother's voice resonating across time as the light flickered out, sealing my fate with just a few simple words hanging ominously in the suffocating air, "Now you'll never make her angry again."